Tonight, we're taking a long, uneasy drive through the back roads of Texas oil country, where the highways stretch forever, the pump jacks creak like dying giants, and shadows move where no one should be. These aren't just stories about work and travel. These are the encounters, the whispers, the things seen from the cab window that make even the toughest oilfield hands shiver. Get ready for 20 dark and terrifying tales from Texas Oilfield Roads that will stay with you long after the engine shuts off. But before we roll into the darkness, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing. And by doing so, they miss the most disturbing, spine-tingling stories that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's journey has just begun, and what waits out there in the oil patch night is far from over. So tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. The road ahead is long, the night is deep, and the terror is waiting just around the bend. Now let's drive into the darkness. The road between Orla and Pecos is nothing but straight asphalt through dust and scrub, the kind of stretch where you can drive for miles without seeing a single set of headlights coming the other way. That kind of emptiness does something to your head. You start to feel like you're the only one left on Earth. The radio static grows louder than the music, the hum of the tires turns into a kind of whisper, and every mile marker you pass looks like the last one. I'd driven those roads for years, working oilfield service jobs that took me from one lease to another, and I thought I knew every flare stack by heart. Most of them flickered and spat only when the wells were active, little licks of fire against the horizon that looked almost pretty at night. But there was one stack outside Orla, set back off a caliche pad that never went out. It didn't matter if the company had shut down the lease, if a rainstorm had just rolled through, or if the rest of the valley was black as pitch. That flare burned. Always. Bright, steady, and wrong. I first noticed it on a stormy night in August, one of those desert downpours that blow up out of nowhere, slam the windshield with sheets of water, then vanish like they'd never been. Lightning tore across the horizon, and between the flashes I saw that orange tongue of flame, bending low against the wind but never once guttering. It was unnatural. Every other flare in the county had been snuffed out by the rain, but not this one. Guys at the yard talked about it the way you talk about a curse, half joking, half dead serious. They said the flame moved if you stared at it too long, bending toward the highway like it was sniffing for fresh meat. They said if you were stupid enough to pull over, you'd hear it calling your name. I laughed along with them, but there was a knot in my stomach each time I drove past and saw that thing burning, steady as a heartbeat. One night I had a haul out that way, sand delivery to a pad north of town. It was late when I hit the stretch near the flare, the kind of dark that makes the world feel hollow. The flame was there, leaning toward the road, its glow painting the cab orange. My hands tightened on the wheel. I told myself I'd just keep going, get the load dropped, and never look back. But the closer I got, the harder it was to ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. My chest buzzed with it, like static electricity. When I passed the pad entrance, I swear the flame tilted, lowering until it pointed straight at me. My headlights caught the shimmer of heat rising off the stack even though the night was cool. Then, faint under the rumble of the engine, I heard my name. I froze, knuckles white on the steering wheel. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the CB. It was a dry, crackling whisper that came from the fire itself, curling through the night like smoke. I hit the brakes before I even realized what I was doing. The rig hissed to a stop on the shoulder, engine idling. I sat there, pulse hammering, telling myself I was crazy. But then it spoke again, clearer this time. My name, drawn out, slow and rasping, like someone had breathed it through a mouthful of ash. The flame bent lower, reaching toward me. Against every instinct I had, I opened the door. The heat hit me in a wave, hotter than it had any right to be from that distance. The smell of burning filled my nose, sharp and oily, but beneath it was something else, something rotten. I stepped onto the gravel shoulder, my boots crunching loud in the silence. The whisper came again, louder now, and it wasn't just my name. It was a sentence. "Come closer. I should have gotten back in the truck and floored it, but my legs didn't feel like mine anymore. I walked toward the lease road, toward the glow. The flame leaned with me, guiding me like a spotlight. The whisper grew steadier, gaining shape. It wasn't just a voice. It was voices, dozens of them, tangled together, men and women, all calling, in dry, broken unison. I thought I recognized one. Tommy. My stomach turned cold. Tommy had been a buddy of mine, another hand who worked the rigs until a blowout near Pecos took him last year. I hadn't thought about him in months, but I knew that voice. I knew it down to the way he stretched the vowels when he was tired. Stopped in the middle of the caliche pad, staring up at the stack. The fire twisted, flaring high like it was excited. I saw shapes in it, faces forming in the curls of flame, mouths opening and closing. For a moment, I thought I saw Tommy's eyes, staring straight through me. The heat was unbearable. Sweat poured down my back, but I couldn't move. The voices rose in a desperate chorus. "Stay," they said. "Stay with us." I don't know how long I stood there before the ground under my boots shifted. Not a quake, not a vibration, it was like the dirt itself was breathing. I snapped back, adrenaline cutting through the haze. I stumbled backward, choking on smoke that wasn't there, and ran for my truck. The voices howled, twisting into something inhuman, and the flame bent after me like it wanted to drag me back. I slammed the door, gunned the engine, and roared down the highway, tires spitting gravel. In the mirror, the flame shot skyward, then snapped straight again, calm as ever, as if nothing had happened. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But the next day at the yard, a driver didn't show for shift. He'd been on the same route as me. They said his truck was found idling on the shoulder near Orla, door open, hazard lights blinking. No sign of him anywhere. Just his boots on the caliche pointing toward the stack. The flame still burns. Every night steady and bright, and sometimes when I pass it, I swear I hear my name again, whispered low under the engine noise. I keep the windows rolled up, eyes fixed ahead, but it doesn't matter. The voice always finds its way in, crawling down my spine like smoke. They say the flare burns because gas still leaks from old wells, a constant trickle that feeds the fire. Maybe that's true. Or maybe it's burning something else entirely. Maybe it's feeding on the ones who stopped when they heard their names. I know one thing. It won't stop with them. The flame that never dies doesn't just burn gas. It waits. It bends toward the road like a predator sniffing out its next meal. And it hasn't given up on me. Not yet. FM 1788 is the kind of road that makes you feel like you're being watched even when you're the only set of headlights cutting through the dark. It runs between Midland and Odessa, a strip of asphalt with pump jacks bowing in the distance and flares winking like orange stars on the horizon. I've worked oilfield jobs up and down this part of Texas, but it was that stretch of road that nearly drove me out of the patch for good. I was a roustabout then, green but steady, mostly running tools and chasing problems for whatever foreman would give me hours. I'd finish up at the yard around midnight and drive the 2-lane back toward my cheap rent trailer outside Odessa. Every night it was the same, an hour and a half of blacktop, pump jacks, and wind scratching the mesquite. I'd turn the radio low just to have some voice in the cab with me, even if it was just an old George Strait tape. The first night I saw it, I figured it was a wreck no one had bothered to clear yet. A pickup, maybe an early 2000s Ford, crushed, in at the front like it had plowed into a wall at full speed. Hood buckled, grill caved, windshield spidered but somehow not shattered. The thing was parked on the shoulder just before a cattle guard, driver's side facing the road, headlights glowing pale yellow in the dark. Nobody was inside. The cab door was shut. I slowed a little, rubbernecking, but didn't stop. When I checked the rear view, the truck's lights seemed to dim for a second like someone had reached out and covered them with their hands. I chalked it up to tired eyes. Next night, same time, same spot. I didn't even think about it until I saw the shine of the lights again. It was identical down to the bent license plate, a piece of it dangling by one screw. The truck hadn't moved. Only this time I noticed the engine wasn't running. I rolled down my window as I passed, and the sound that met me was silence. No fan, no ticking metal. Just the cold idle of something that shouldn't be lit at all. By the third night, it started to eat at me. I slowed down more than I should have, eyeing the truck as I rolled past. The air was cooler by the ditch, heavy with that faint scorch smell you get when brake pads burn. The cab was empty again, but I got the notion someone had just stepped out. The driver's seat was pressed down like weight had been there seconds ago. The clock on my dash said 3:11 a.m. After a week of this, the wreck had burned into my brain. Every night, headlights like a waiting dog, cab cold, engine dead, and me driving by like I wasn't about to lose my mind. On the 8th night, I stopped. I pulled my beater truck over 20 yards ahead and sat with my hands tight on the wheel. The other pickup's lights beamed into the back of my cab like a pair of unblinking eyes. When I finally stepped out, boots crunching caliche, the air had a static weight to it. Not wind, not cicadas, not even the faint pop of flares. Dead still. I walked up slow, flashlight beam jittering on the hood. The glass on the windshield was cool, no condensation, no dust. I pressed my hand to the hood out of habit. Stone cold. I cupped my light into the cab. Nothing. Seat fabric torn, dashboard cracked, but not a drop of blood. No airbag. Nothing to show a crash had ever happened. That should have been the end of it, but something inside me needed to mark the moment, like leaving proof I'd seen it. I fished a notepad out of my glove box, scribbled, "Are you okay?" and tucked it under the wiper blade. Then I left. When I got home that morning, too wired to sleep, I showered and dropped into bed around 6. When I rolled over at noon, there was the note, folded clean, resting under my pillow. My own handwriting. I told myself I'd dreamed it, that I must have pulled it back from the wiper and forgotten. But the paper smelled like diesel and cold metal. My sheets smelled faintly the same. I didn't tell anyone. Out in the field, superstition runs deep, but no one wants to be the guy spooking about ghosts when there's pipe to haul. The next night, I left another note. Just one word this time. Who? I put it under the wiper with a shaking hand, trying not to look at the shadows in the brush line. I drove home like the devil was drafting behind me. When I pulled my covers back, the note was waiting again. Only this time it had an answer scrawled in handwriting that wasn't mine. Look behind you. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the trailer frame felt like footsteps. I bolted the door, shut the blinds, left the TV on, and still woke up to find the paper folded neat under my pillow. I tried ignoring it. I told myself it wasn't real, that maybe some prankster had staged the wreck and I was just tired enough to fall for it. But the truck was there every night and my eyes went hunting for it before the mile marker even came up. The road felt wrong without it. On the 12th night, I wrote nothing. I just took the note I'd left before, folded blank paper, and shoved it under the wiper. That morning, the paper under my pillow was covered corner to corner in teeth marks. Deep indents like someone had bitten down again and again until the pulp tore. I threw it into the trash barrel and doused it with lighter fluid. It screamed when it burned. Not like paper crackling, but like brakes locking up on asphalt. Metal. On metal sharp and alive. By then I was losing my grip. My coworkers noticed me dragging, bloodshot, jittery. The foreman told me to lay off the uppers, but I wasn't on anything but fear and caffeine. I told myself I'd skip the road altogether, take the longer way around through Gardendale, but when I tried, my steering wheel pulled like it wanted to turn, like something had its hand on the column. I ended up back on FM 1788 without meaning to, headlights washing over that damned pickup again at exactly 3:11. The final night is the one. I can't scrub out no matter how I drink or pray. I pulled over like always, shaking with a mix of dread and compulsion. I left one last note written in a hand barely my own. What do you want? I wedged it under the wiper and stood there waiting, heart trying to climb out of my throat. For the first time, the driver's side door creaked open. It didn't swing wide, just eased enough that the cab light flickered. The seatbelt hung loose. There was no one inside. When I got home, the note was waiting under my pillow, but the words had changed. My handwriting was gone. In thick tar-dark strokes it read, "Your turn." I didn't sleep that day. I didn't sleep the next. By the third, my body gave out. I dreamed of headlights filling my trailer, cold air spilling across the floor. When I woke, there was gravel under my back and the smell of hot oil in my nose. I was lying in the ditch by FM 1788, and my own truck sat 10 feet away, front caved in, lights burning though the engine was cold. Now I don't drive that road. Anymore. I don't drive at night if I can help it. But every so often I find a folded scrap under my pillow smelling of diesel, with words I don't want to read. I never leave notes anymore. It doesn't matter. They keep coming. And one day soon, I know the cab light's going to flick on again and there won't be a seat left empty. The Caliche Road began just outside Mentone. A pale scar cut through scrub mesquite and saltbush, dusting everything white in its wake. The hauler's GPS told him it was the quickest route to the disposal site, and out here in the dead flat of Loving County, there weren't many roads worth trusting. He followed the turn without thinking much about it, the tires humming on the chalky surface, the load behind him shifting with the rhythm of the truck. His dash clock read 2:14 a.m. He had 3 more loads to make before sunrise, and with every mile he could almost hear the time card ticking in his head. Only the miles weren't matching up. By the time he passed the first pump jack, his odometer showed 6 extra miles that didn't belong, though the clock had barely moved a minute. He frowned, tapped the glass of the dash like a man testing a watch battery and pressed on. The pump jacks stood like skeleton horses in the dark, their horse heads frozen mid-bob, arms rusting in place. He passed one, then another, each exactly the same, each with the faint outline of a tank battery squatting behind it. None of them moved. No counterweights swung. No motors churned. The lights were dead, and the sound of diesel and hydraulics that usually bled out into the night was gone. All he heard was his own engine and the faint hiss of dust swirling under the chassis. He glanced down at his clock. Still 2:14. Odometer now 47 miles higher. His mouth went dry. He told himself he'd overshot the turn. Lease roads crisscrossed, out here like veins, most of them barely wider than cattle paths, and GPS signals weren't gospel under this endless sky. But when he slowed and squinted out the window, the Caliche stretched straight ahead into the dark, unbroken, no cattle, guards, no gates, no junctions, just white dust catching the headlights and the same unmoving machinery fading past his windows. He reached down to his thermos, took a swig of coffee, and let it burn down his throat. Then he noticed something in the mirror. His tire tracks. Faint ridges in the Caliche, not behind him where they should be, but faintly etched ahead, leading deeper into the road he hadn't yet traveled. He pressed the brake, hard enough to jolt the load, and stared. The tracks curved with the road, exactly as his had, the same tread, the same spacing. His heart thudded against his ribs. He pulled to the shoulder, though shoulder was too generous a word out here, just loose brush and Caliche chunks. He stepped down, boots crunching in the dust, and crouched near the tracks. Fresh. The edges, still crisp. No wind had dulled them. No sand drifted over. He followed them with his eyes as far as the headlights reached and saw them vanish under the shadow of the next pump jack. He looked back at his own truck. The exhaust plumed in the cold air, taillights dim against the dark. Behind them, the Caliche was smooth, untouched, like he had never driven this stretch at all. He climbed back into the cab, breathing through his teeth, and turned the wheel hard. If the GPS wanted him to keep going, it could go to hell. He was going back to the highway, but when he swung the rig around, easing carefully so the trailer didn't fishtail into the brush, his headlights cut across the road he had just left, tire tracks, clear and deep, running toward him. His own, but not his own, because they were there before he got there, and they were coming straight at him. He froze with his hands on the wheel, staring as the beams caught the glint of chrome, far down the stretch. Another truck, same make, same model, trailer dusted white, crawling up the lease road toward him with steady inevitability. His heart kicked, and he jammed the shifter into reverse, the hauler lurching as he tried to back into the scrub. Mesquite scraped the side, tires spun, and for a second he thought he was stuck. He floored it, engine howling, and the rig clawed, free onto a bare patch. He swung out of the way, dust boiling around him, and stared as the other truck bore down. The lights grew until they swallowed the cab, until he braced for impact. But there was no crash, just silence, like the engine had died. And when he opened his eyes, there was no truck, no lights, no sound but his own panting breath. He shifted back onto the road, hands trembling, and eased forward, praying the next bend would spit him out near the highway, near anything familiar. The odometer ticked another 10 miles. The clock still said 2:14. The same pump jack loomed ahead, rust frozen mid-nod, and under its shadow the tire tracks still waited, leading him deeper, as if they'd always known he'd follow. By the time he realized he couldn't remember his own name, it didn't matter anymore. The truck rolled on, tires humming, dust curling white behind wheels that left no mark. Out here the lease road had no end, and neither did he. Out at the edge of Kermit, where the Caliche Road thins to powder and the pump jacks bow like praying iron giants, there's an SWD well that doesn't sit right. I worked at nights, mostly because nobody else wanted to. The pay was better on nights, too, a few bucks more an hour. But the real reason was that I'd rather not have to explain to anyone what I sometimes saw out there. At 2 in the morning, the place had a way of feeling alive in a way no collection of pipes and tanks should. The pit was fenced off, but you could hear it from the catwalk, that slow glugging like a throat swallowing in its sleep. Saltwater disposal is usually just dirty water, chemical runoff, oil traces, black and foul, but ordinary. At this site, the water seemed to shift on its own. It never sat still. On a windless night, it would ripple as if something huge was breathing just below. I'd shine my light across it, and it would look slick and mirror dark until something pale floated up. That's how it started anyway. A week after that driller went missing out by Jal, we were still getting the alerts, the emails, the flyers, stapled at gas stations. He was a roughneck named Tiller, stocky, tattooed, the kind who'd outdrink anyone in the doghouse. Folks said he wandered off drunk and got lost. I didn't buy it. Nobody just wanders out there and disappears without a trace. That night, the gurgling felt louder, like the pit was restless. I skimmed the skimmer net across the surface to clear a sheen and pulled something heavy. When I lifted it in the light, it was slick and wrinkled. At first I thought it was a trash bag, but the smell hit before the sight. It wasn't plastic, it was skin. A strip of sunburnt hide, raw on one side, with a faded tattoo of a barbed wire loop. I'd seen it before, on Tiller's forearm. I dropped it so fast the net clanged the railing. My first thought was to call it in, but who was going to believe me? Found a driller's arm skin in the SWD tank doesn't get you anything but a drug test and a pink slip. So I rinsed my hands with diesel and kept my mouth shut. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Next night, I brought my phone. I set it on record and walked the catwalk slow. The pit burbled and hissed, though there was no injection running. My light caught something that wasn't right. Air bubbles, slow and fat, rolling up from the middle. Then the surface broke like lips parting, and I swear I heard a wet sigh escape. It wasn't my imagination. My recording picked it up too, that faint exhale like someone surfacing from a dive. I told myself it was gas release. Hydrogen sulfide can seep up through bad cement jobs. But the more I thought, the less it made sense. That tank had been capped, solid since before I hired on. No leaks, no vent lines, just water going down and nowhere else to go. A few nights later, the pit wasn't just breathing, it was muttering. The wind was dead still, my rig radio silent, but beneath the burbles came a voice. Raspy, muffled, broken up by liquid. I leaned closer and caught words scattered like bones in a ditch. Help, cold, get me. My knees locked. It was Tiller's voice. I knew it from safety meetings, from the jokes he'd tell too loud. It was him, but hollowed out, drowned. I backed off the catwalk, slipped on the steel, and nearly pitched myself into the rail. My light swung wild across the tanks, and in the reflection of the water I thought I saw a face pressed up from below, wide-eyed and gasping. By the time I steadied the beam, it was gone. The company man didn't want to hear about it. I tried a careful version. That SWD's acting up might be venting gas. He shrugged, told me to keep the gauges in range and log my rounds. Nobody else ever volunteered nights out there, so it was me and the thing in the water. It got bolder. I'd find wet footprints on the catwalk, barefoot, tracked across the steel. Sometimes the gauges would spike when nothing was running. Once I climbed the stairs and found a glove nailed to the rail with a rusty spike, stiff with salt crust. It was the same brand Tiller wore, initials burned into the cuff. The sound of the pit changed too. The gurgle grew into a churn, like something swimming lazy circles. When I dropped the skimmer, it snagged on something that pulled back. I nearly lost the handle, and when I yanked it free, the netting tore. The hole looked like it had been ripped from inside. Sleep stopped coming easy. I'd lie in the man camp bunk hearing that water in my head, that thick voice whispering like it was rising through the pipes under my bed. One night I dreamed the pit wasn't a pit at all, but a throat. The tank's teeth, the piping veins. The whole well was a body sprawled under the Permian, and it was hungry. 2 weeks after I first found the skin, another man went missing. A wireline hand this time, parked his pickup at a lease road gate and never checked in. Search crews combed the sand hills, found nothing. And back at the SWD, the water had turned slicker, darker, with a faint coppery sheen like dried blood, diluted. I stopped logging the night straight. I'd sit in the control shack with the lights off and watch the pit through the window. Sometimes I'd see ripples push up against the steel sides like palms pressing. Sometimes I'd hear two voices at once, overlapping. The worst night I fell asleep in the shack chair. I woke choking on water. My boots were full, my shirt soaked, though I'd never left the chair. The pit was calm outside, but on my desk lay another strip of skin, pale and translucent, with a tattoo I didn't recognize yet. The next day, word spread of another missing roughneck. I quit a week later, packed my gear, signed my release, and didn't look back. But I can't shake the sound that tank made, the way it sucked at the air like lungs filling. Folks in Kermit still say men go missing, and maybe they wander, maybe they don't. Sometimes I dream I'm back on that catwalk leaning over with the skimmer, and when I pull it up, I see my own arm hanging in the net, my tattoo stretching like wet paper. When I wake, my skin feels loose, like it doesn't quite fit. The pit's still out there. It doesn't stop. It just waits for the next shift, the next hand to lean close. They think it's just wastewater, just a tank swallowing what the rigs don't want. But I know better. Something down there takes more than brine. Something down there breathes. And once it gets a taste of you, it doesn't forget. The Wink sinkholes had been part of the oilfield folklore for decades. Great scars in the earth where brine and gas had gnawed away limestone until the ground simply gave up. From the air, they looked like forgotten craters on a lunar plain, round and silent, swallowing mesquite trees, utility poles, and sometimes cattle that wandered too close. Folks in Wink called them hungry, like the earth was alive and waiting, and you couldn't blame them because now and then you'd hear a noise out there on the flats, a hollow hiss like a kettle steaming underground. That's what drew Calvin Bell the night his service truck went down. He'd been running lines for a midstream outfit, checking pressure at a battery east of town. The work was lonely but steady, the kind of job where the hours stretched long and your only company was a truck radio, fading between Tejano and AM static. It was near midnight when he parked, clipboard balanced on his thigh, filling out readings. The ground was quiet, too quiet for Wink. Usually the pump jacks clanged or coyotes yipped. Tonight there was nothing but that slow wind that comes across the flats, dry and patient, carrying the smell of sulfur and oil. The first pop sounded like a firecracker. The second was deeper, a groan under the caliche lot. Before Calvin could throw the truck in reverse, the earth fell out from under him. The service rig dropped nose first into darkness, the hood crumpling, metal screaming as the whole cab tilted and shuddered. For one blink, he thought it was just a cave-in, dust rising, steering wheel jerking in his hands. The next blink, he was outside the truck, crawling out of grit and pebbles into a darkness so different it felt wrong, like stepping into another kind of night. The air stung his lungs, not with dust but with age. He coughed, blinking, and saw that the truck was gone, as if it had never been. His boots scuffed on hardpan, but the caliche yard wasn't there anymore. He stood, heart racing, and noticed the sky. It wasn't black. It was a washed-out gray, starless, like sunlight had burned it decades too long. His own hands looked foreign, pale and stiff. When he touched his face, his skin was hot and papery, the texture of leather left in a window. He staggered toward the highway, trying to get his bearings. Wink should have been to the west, Odessa farther beyond, but the lights were wrong. They were older, fewer, gas flares dotting the horizon like ghosts of rigs that hadn't run in years. When he finally reached the road, an old Chevy pickup roared past with faded lettering on the door. Andrews Welding, stenciled in a style he hadn't seen since his father's day. The driver glanced at him like he'd seen a corpse walk out of the brush, swerved, and gunned the engine without looking back. Calvin stumbled on, confused. He knew his body felt wrong. His shoulders ached, knees weak, and when he caught sight of himself in the glass of a darkened store window, he froze. The man staring back wasn't 39 anymore. He was weathered, face-lined, hair gone white and brittle. His clothes hung loose like they'd dried on a scarecrow. His own eyes were clouded, shot through with veins. He made it to town by dawn, limping down Wink's main drag. The cafe where he sometimes grabbed coffee after night shift was boarded, over, paint sun-flaked to powder. A feed store he didn't recognize stood where the taco truck usually parked. He thought maybe he'd lost time, maybe a day or two, until he saw the posters on the wall. They weren't fresh. They were sun-bleached, peeling, advertising a rodeo from 1983. Panic hit him then, and he knew where he had to go. His house was just off the highway, a clapboard with a carport he'd built himself, chain-link fence sagging around the yard. When he reached it, he stopped dead. The place looked lived in, yard trimmed, curtains drawn, but the vehicles in the drive weren't his. A late-model GMC, a minivan, both too new for him to know. He pounded on the door until it opened. A woman stood there, older, gray streaking her hair. It was Amanda, his wife. Except not. She looked right through him, confused. Then her face changed, a hand flying to her mouth. "Calvin," she whispered, but not with recognition. More like a nightmare come to her porch. Behind her, a man appeared, broad-shouldered, steady. One of the boys from town Calvin half remembered. He put an arm around Amanda like it had been there for years. Calvin's chest burned. "I just fell," he croaked, voice ragged and unused. "Amanda, I just fell. Truck went in. I crawled out. I've been gone a minute, maybe two." She shook, her head slowly, eyes filling. "Calvin," she said, voice breaking, "you've been gone 40 years. The words struck harder than any fall. His knees buckled. He gripped the doorframe, sun-bleached fingers trembling. The man stepped forward firm. "You need to leave," he said. Not angry, not cruel, but final. Calvin looked past him, saw family pictures on the wall. Kids, grown kids. A life that had gone on without him. He tried to shout, to demand, but what came out was a cracked moan, too old, too broken. He staggered back into the sunlight, staring at the changed world, the houses, the faces that didn't know him anymore. Later, folks in Wink said they saw him wandering the sinkholes, muttering about time stolen, skin burning under the merciless sun. He swore he was cheated, swore he'd only fallen for a second. Some said they heard him at night howling from the edge of the pits, a voice too old to be living but too angry to be gone. And when the ground hissed again, when the caliche popped, and another hole began to settle, the roughnecks swore they saw him standing at the edge, glaring at the town that had moved on, eyes like pale glass, waiting for the earth to open again so he could drag someone else down with him. Man Camp 23 sat at the edge of the sandhills outside Monahan's, a row of gray prefab trailers laid out like dominoes in the flat dust, each one squatting low against the West Texas wind. It wasn't a big camp by oilfield standards, just a 24-man setup meant to house roughnecks on rotation, but lately it had been empty. The company roster showed no crews assigned, no hands checked in, no catering deliveries scheduled, nothing but a shell waiting for the next frack job. That's why it rattled the foreman, a man named Clay Martinez, when he unlocked the gate and stepped inside one November afternoon, only to find the place humming with life that shouldn't have been there. From the moment he walked in, something felt wrong. The air carried that heavy, lived-in smell of sweat and soap, not the stale emptiness he expected. The heaters were running, humming faintly through the ducts. In the first bunk room, he checked. Blankets lay crumpled with the faint warmth of bodies, still lingering in them. On the floor beneath the bed sat rows of boots, scuffed and dusty, aligned neatly as if by men trained in habit. The showers at the far end hissed with hot water, steam curling beneath the door. Clay stopped there, one hand hovering near the knob, but he didn't open it. He just stood listening, trying to decide whether it was worse to hear voices or to hear nothing at all. In the end, it was silence, only water striking tile that made his skin crawl. The company system said the camp was empty. No crews, no maintenance contractors, not even a catering drop-off. Clay had signed off on that paperwork himself. He walked the length of the trailer, checking each door, each bunk, finding the same thing over and over: warm sheets, the smell of fresh sweat and deodorant, showers running though no one stood inside, wet towels draped across hooks. In the kitchen, mugs sat half full of coffee gone cold, spoons resting on paper plates smeared with beans. He turned a few over, reading logos from service companies that hadn't been on contract in years. Halliburton, Key Energy, Patterson, rigs long gone. He rubbed his thumb over one logo until the ink smudged, as if that might explain how the cup got there. Clay went back to his truck, sat behind the wheel, and pulled up the security feed on his tablet. The cameras ringed the exterior and a few were inside, mounted in common areas. The first feed showed the bunk room. The beds were empty, visibly empty, but as he watched, the mattress nearest the door sagged in the middle, compressing as though someone had just lain down. Then another bed did the same, and another, until it looked like 6 invisible men were stretched out side by side. Clay leaned forward, squinting, waiting for some camera glitch to explain it. But the footage was live. The bed shifted subtly, the blankets tugging, the faint impression of breathing beneath fabric. He switched to another camera. The kitchen table sat deserted, but one chair slid out a few inches, then another, until the table looked ready for men to sit. He could hear nothing through the feed. No voices or laughter, only the quiet sound of pipes hissing with water. He drove into Monahan's that evening, sat in a booth at Stripes with a styrofoam cup of coffee, and tried to figure out what he'd seen. He'd worked the Permian 20 years, seen everything from men baked to death in their trucks to rigs torched in lightning strikes. He knew how to explain things: gas leaks, electrical faults, drunk hands doing stupid things. But this wasn't that. He thought about calling his boss in Midland, but what would he say? "The camp's empty, sir, but the ghosts are keeping the showers hot." They'd laugh him off, maybe pull him from foreman duty, send him back to running pipe like a green hand. The next morning, Clay returned with a different plan. He parked, went straight to the camp's breaker box, and cut power to the entire set of trailers. The hum of heaters died, the lights snapped off, the showers cut midstream. He waited. Silence settled, thick and deep, and for a moment he thought he'd solved it. But when he stepped back into the bunkhouse, the smell was worse. Sweat and something sharper, like metal. The beds were still warm. In the dark, he could hear bed springs creak one after another, as though the invisible men were shifting restlessly in their sleep. He left the lights off and watched. Slowly, boots slid. Across the floorboards, the scrape of rubber soles against linoleum. None of them moved far, only a shuffle, but the sound was enough to make him retreat. That night he dreamed he was inside the camp, though he wasn't sure it was a dream. He lay in one of the bunks, staring at the ceiling, aware of the men around him. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them breathing. Long, steady exhales, the rhythm of exhausted men dead asleep. When he tried to get up, his chest felt heavy, pressed down by the weight of unseen arms. He woke in his truck, sweat beating across his neck, the keys still in the ignition. The camp door behind him was ajar. By the third day, he brought help. A younger hand named Tyrell, green but tough, the kind of kid who carried a pistol in his glove box even to pump gas. Clay didn't tell him the truth, just said vandals had been sneaking into Man Camp 23. Maybe copper thieves. They walked through, together, Tyrell muttering about the smell. They checked each room, found the same warm bunks, the same boots, the same showers that hissed with no one inside. Tyrell swore and drew his gun, pointing it at nothing. When they got to the kitchen, both men froze. The table was set, 12 plates, each with a tin of Vienna sausages split open, each with a can of Shiner beer beside it, still cold enough to bead condensation. Tyrell reached out, touched one of the beers and flinched like he'd grabbed a hot stove. He swore it felt like a hand pulled back. Clay forced himself to check the cameras again. The feed showed the bunkhouse, men sitting up in bed, swinging invisible legs to the floor. Their boots shifted, rising from neat rows to scatter across the floor. Tyrell turned pale, lowered his pistol. "There ain't no one there," he said, voice breaking. "There ain't no one there, but they're here." They left without speaking. On the drive back to town, Clay saw Tyrell's hands shaking so badly he could barely keep the truck straight. The company never sent crews back to Man Camp 23. Officially, it was marked condemned due to faulty plumbing and a structural hazard. Clay knew better. He kept the key but never returned except once. A month later, he drove past out of curiosity. The camp lights glowed in the distance, though the breakers were off and no power lines fed it anymore. He stopped at the gate, watched figures move in the windows. Just shadows, the tilt of heads, the bend of arms, nothing solid. But he knew the camp was full. Every bunk was taken, every plate laid out, every shower running. He sat there a long time, the engine idling, until the smell hit him even through the truck's vents. Sweat and soap, but heavier now, ripe with something sour, like rot left out in the desert sun. He turned around and never came back. Man Camp 23 is still there. Folks in Monahans don't talk about it, but sometimes truckers say they see the trailers lit up, men standing outside smoking, leaning against the rails. They wave as if expecting company, but when you drive up, the yard is empty, the door's locked, and if you check inside, the bunks are warm, always warm. The sour gas alarm split the morning silence like a banshee shrieking out of the scrubland. I was half asleep in the cab of the truck, parked on the edge of the lease, when it went off. That high-pitched warble was enough to yank me upright, heart pounding, hands fumbling for the mask on the seat beside me. Crane County mornings are usually quiet, broken only by the hum of pump jacks or the distant groan of trucks on 385, but this one was broken wide open by the sound of danger you can't see. Hydrogen sulfide doesn't wait, doesn't give you time. One lungful, maybe two, and you're done. I strapped on the mask and shoved open the door. The wind out there was dry and hot, already smelling faintly of iron and dust, but underneath it was something else, something faint and rotten. The well had been shut in for 3 weeks, pressure bled off, tank empty. At least that's what the paperwork said. A small site, one of those forgotten corners of the field the company keeps alive on paper until it decides to plug it or bring it back. I knew the alarm system wasn't perfect, but it wasn't junk either. If it was crying, something had stirred, the well awake. I walked across the caliche pad, boots crunching, the scrubby mesquite casting low shadows, the alarm still wailing, and then I saw them. 4 dead birds, all different kinds, sparrows, a dove, even a hawk, lay scattered across the berm like they'd fallen from the sky. A jackrabbit lay twisted with its eyes half open, and just beyond it, a coyote stretched, stiff as a board, tongue blackened, lips curled back over its teeth. All of them pointed toward the wellhead as if drawn to it. The sight made the skin under my coveralls crawl. Dead animals weren't new in oil country, but not clustered like that, not with the alarm screaming. I moved closer, checking the gauges, the casing, the lines. Everything read 0. My breath echoed inside the mask, hot and metallic, until I Got the stupid idea to lift it just for a second, just to taste the air myself. I shouldn't have. The second the seal broke, something rushed in that wasn't only the faint, sour stink I expected. What I heard was a sob, sharp and wet, a woman crying, not out in the air but inside the mask with me, her voice bouncing off the plastic and rubber as if she'd been trapped in there all along. My chest locked up, lungs burning, and I slammed the mask back on, but the sound lingered, fading like she'd been pulled down a hallway. I staggered back from the well, bile rising in my throat. The dead coyote seemed closer now, its glassy eyes on me. I told myself it was just the wind carrying sounds through the mask's filters, just nerves. But the sob had weight to it, sorrow so raw it didn't belong in my own head. I checked the alarm panel, reset it, tried to get my hand steady enough to make sense of the numbers. 0 pressure, 0 flow. The well was as dead as the animals at my feet, so why the alarm? I radioed it in, voice shaking as I tried to sound calm. Dispatch told me to stay put, that a safety officer was already en route from Midland. That gave me at least an hour alone. The alarm had cut out, leaving the pad in a silence that was worse, heavy as a lid. I sat in the truck with the engine idling, mask on the dash, watching heat waves shimmer off the caliche. I could still hear her sometimes, soft, like she was trying to keep quiet, muffled crying from nowhere. Then the smell got stronger. Sour, like eggs left in the sun, but under it was something sickly sweet, like perfume gone stale. I stepped back, out and checked the separators again, even though I knew it was useless. The wind shifted and that perfume smell wrapped around me, cloying, almost warm. I could taste it in my mouth. And then the mask on the dash hissed. Not a leak, not air escaping, but inhaling, a slow drag, followed by the faint hitch of another. Sob. I froze. The rubber straps lifted slightly as if someone had slipped it on an invisible face. I backed toward the truck, heart hammering. The mask lay flat again, still as if it had never moved. I told myself to get in, to drive, to leave the site until backup arrived, but my boots felt nailed down. A shadow passed over the caliche, long and thin, though there were no clouds and no birds overhead. I swear it stretched from the wellhead straight to me, reaching like an arm. The dead rabbit twitched then, a dry spasm of legs against stone, though its chest was caved in and flies already crawled its eyes. My stomach turned to ice. The radio crackled. A voice came through, not dispatch, not any voice I recognized. A woman whispering so faintly I had to press the speaker to my ear. "Take it off," she said, as if urging me to lift my mask again. I threw the radio down, grabbed the mask off the dash, and shoved it into the passenger footwell like it might crawl up my face on its own. The smell grew unbearable, a mix of rot and perfume, and the crying started again, louder, filling the truck cab. Not from the radio or the mask, but from everywhere at once. I couldn't take it. I put the truck in gear and tore out down the lease road, dust boiling up behind me. The sound followed, fading only when the well pad shrank to a shimmer in the mirror. By the time I hit the highway, my hands were trembling so hard I could barely steer. I didn't stop until I reached Crane, pulling into a gas station, cutting the engine, sitting there drenched in sweat. The smell was gone. The crying stopped. The mask lay where I'd thrown it, silent. The safety officer called me later, said he found nothing wrong with the site, no leak, no gas, no alarm going off when he got there. Just a few dead animals, which he chalked up to heat stroke. He told me maybe I imagined it. Maybe the mask played tricks. Maybe I dozed off and dreamed it. But I know what I heard. I know what tried to breathe through that mask. And when I went back to the truck the next morning, trying to shake it off, the mask was waiting in the passenger seat, buckled neatly into place, straps pulled tight as if someone had worn it and left it for me again. West Texas nights have a way of pressing in. A big empty weight that settles on your shoulders and makes the dark feel thicker than anywhere else. Out on Highway 385 north of Andrews, the oilfield truckers say you can drive for hours and feel like you're standing still. The road stretching out flat and silver under the moon with nothing but the occasional pump jack bowing in the distance. That's where I was running with a 3-truck convoy, hauling drill pipe to a rig near Seminole. The radio's buzzing every few minutes with check-ins, jokes, and the kind of muttered curses you only hear when men have been running hard on little sleep. The first odd thing started with a blur in my side mirror. I was middle truck, boxed between Rick up front and Alvarez bringing up the tail. I saw it just past mile marker 47, something low and fast, too quick for me to focus on, like a dog or a coyote but running stride for stride with my trailer tires. I checked the mirrors again, and the asphalt was bare, just the pale stripe rolling behind me. Rick came on the CB, voice rough with static. "Y'all see that? By my left rear." Alvarez answered a second later, said he saw nothing but heat waves. I didn't say a word. There was no point. Out here, fatigue and mirages could trick your eyes easy enough, but it didn't stop. Every few miles I'd catch a smear of movement in the convex glass. It never broke into the headlights, never showed in the glow of taillights either, just stayed in that in-between place. The reflection you half trust, but can't touch. Sometimes it looked stretched like a man running hunched, arms dangling, long as fence wire. Other times it looked like a four-legged shadow keeping perfect rhythm with the wheels. Rick slowed a hair, said over the radio he'd lost visual. A beat later, Alvarez answered back. Only the voice wasn't his, it was Billy's. We all froze up when we heard it. "I got him now, he's on my back bumper." That's what it said, clear as daylight. And it was Billy's tone, Billy's lazy panhandle drawl that we all knew. The only problem was Billy had wrapped his Kenworth around a cottonwood last December, drunk on his way back from Hobbs. He'd been laid in the ground before Christmas. I'd been one of the pallbearers. Rick cursed under his breath, low and steady. Alvarez broke in, swearing up and down it wasn't him who keyed the mic, but the voice came again, thick with a grin none of us could see. "Running good tonight, boys, ain't tired yet." The air inside my cab went dead. Even with the heater blowing, I felt a cold run up through my boots like someone had spilled water on the floorboard. The road kept sliding under us, the white lines ticking by, but I couldn't keep my eyes off those mirrors. The smear was gone now, replaced by nothing at all. Yet I couldn't shake the sense something hung inches off my back tires. Close enough that if I braked, I'd feel it slap. The trailer. Rick told us to keep tight. No stopping until Seminole. His voice was high and tight, not the usual command. We did as we were told. Still, the chatter started. First Billy again, saying he was cold. Then laughing, too loud in the speakers. Alvarez shut his set off altogether. I tried, but mine crackled. Back on without me touching the switch, the dial lighting up like someone else had turned it. The laughter came through again. I could hear Rick breathing hard on channel 19, and I swear I heard him whispering a prayer between breaths. When we hit the county line sign, the movement started again, this time in all three mirrors at once, like shadows pacing us from both ditches. I could make out the curve of shoulders, long hair whipping back, but never a face. Rick shouted we were pushing through. His voice broke off mid-word like the mic had been yanked away. The silence after was worse than anything, just tires humming on pavement and that endless dark pressing against the glass. I don't remember the next 15 miles. My mind kept looping back to Billy's funeral, the way the ground had frozen, hard, the hollow ring when the dirt hit his coffin lid. My palms were wet against the wheel. When I finally came to, I was already rolling through the rig access gate, brakes squealing, Alvarez cussing behind me. Rick's truck was parked crooked, just off the pad, driver's side door hanging wide open, cab empty. No tracks in the caliche, no footprints, just the hum of his engine and the radio hissing. We searched until dawn, walking out with flashlights, calling his name into the mesquite. Nothing answered. When the company man came out, he told us to shut up about it, file our logs clean, no mention of voices or shadows. They brought Rick's truck back into Andrews later that day. Inside the cab, wedged into the seat, was a scrap of logbook paper. The handwriting was shaky, but you could still read it. "Still running. Keep up." That was all it said. I haven't driven nights since. Some runs you don't walk away from even when you keep breathing. Out here in the Permian, the road has its own hunters, and sometimes they wear familiar faces. The pit at Pyote was nothing more than a scar in the ground. A dried-out borrow pit from some old roadwork project that had been abandoned long before most men alive could remember. The sun baked it until it cracked like old leather. A yawning depression that collected bones, beer bottles, and blown trash. Everyone in Ward County knew to give it wide berth. Not because of superstition, but because the wind there did strange things. Drivers said their rigs would list when they passed it, tires tugged by invisible currents. More than one rancher swore he heard voices when he cut across the flats on a summer night, wind carrying words that sounded like his own. But those stories stayed barroom talk, muttered over long necks after midnight, until the day Billy Haskins took his vac truck out there and never came back. Billy had been hauling water for 7 years, and he was steady, the kind of man dispatchers trusted with long leases and off-hour calls. He was a big fellow with a gentle streak, divorced twice, still carrying a photo of his little girl in the visor, though she was 20 now. Folks said he was too soft-hearted for oilfield life, but he kept his head down and worked. That morning had been clear, the kind of brutal August sun that bleaches everything bone white. He was on a run past Pyote, empty on his way to a tank battery, when he saw the swirl. At first it looked like a dust devil, no different from 100 others you'd see crossing the basin in summer. But this one didn't move with the wind. It climbed up out of the pit, slender at its base, widening until it was tall as a derrick, twisting tight as braided rope. Billy eased his truck down to third, watching in his side mirror. The column of dust tilted, leaned, and then, like a dog trotting after its master, it slid across the flats and took up position behind his trailer. The CB crackled with chatter from other drivers on the channel, but Billy kept quiet, eyes flicking between his mirrors. The dust devil kept pace, never quite overtaking, never falling back. He could see debris whipping inside it, paper, weeds, the glint of something metallic. He told himself it was just coincidence, the wind eddying along his wake. But it felt like more than that. Every time he tapped the brakes, it slowed. Every time he downshifted to take a curve, it mirrored his movement, circling closer to the right rear tire, then back again, as if sniffing him out. By the time he hit the Caliche lease road, sweat ran cold under his shirt despite the heat. He flipped the radio to company channel, keyed the mic, then let go without saying a word. Something in him wanted to keep this quiet, as though speaking of it aloud would make it real. That's when he heard the first voice. It came in the whine of the dust, high-pitched and brittle, like wind over broken glass. At first it was nonsense, a jumble of static and air, but then it bent into words. "Billy, payday's late again. Son, they're cheating you." The voice was his father's, dead 10 years, gravelly and sure, the same one that used to shout across corrals at feeding time. Billy jerked his head, staring into the mirror. Inside the swirl, he thought he saw something flutter, a strip of green paper, maybe a paycheck stub with ink bleeding across it. He pressed the accelerator. The truck roared, dust pluming behind, but the devil clung to him, matching his speed. The next sound wasn't his father at all, but his ex-wife, sharp and cutting, the same tone she'd used in the kitchen the night she packed her bags. "You never listen. You drink and you waste, and you wonder why we're gone." The words cut deeper than any knife, rising and falling in rhythm with the spin. Billy's hands trembled on the wheel. He told himself it was just memory, stress, the heat, but the voices kept coming, cycling through the years like someone had pulled open the drawers of his life and dumped them into the whirlwind. A lullaby drifted next, soft and sweet, one he hadn't heard since his daughter was small. He'd sung it to her in a rocking chair, back when his first marriage had still been whole, before long hours and bitterness had driven everything apart. The sound hollowed him out. He wanted to believe it was imagination, some trick of nerves, but the notes were clear, carrying through the cab as if someone were humming right behind his seat. His throat tightened until he could hardly breathe. Billy pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under his tires. The devil slowed too, spiraling in place just off the passenger door, whipping dust and bits of paper against the glass. The air tasted of dirt and metal, dry enough to scrape his tongue. He sat there, motor idling, staring at it, The column bent closer, and within its twist he swore he saw faces, his father's, his ex's, his daughter's, shifting in and out like reflections on water. Their mouths opened and closed, matching the words he heard. He wanted to key the call it in, but his hand froze. Some part of him didn't want anyone to break this spell. He had to know what it wanted. The voices came all at once, overlapping, a storm of remembered shouts and whispers. Then, sudden as a whip crack, they stopped. Silence rushed in, louder than any roar. The dust thinned, edges unraveling, but at its heart something dark pulsed, small as a fist and beating like one. Billy cut the engine. The quiet was immense. He opened the door, boots crunching on gravel, and stepped into the dry heat. The swirl leaned toward him. A strip of paper slapped against his chest, sticking with static. He peeled it free. It was a pay stub, yellowed and torn, with his name typed in faded ink. The date was from 1983, back when he'd been a roustabout fresh out of high school. His hands shook. He should have run then, climbed back in the cab, called someone, but he didn't. He stood there listening. The lullaby rose again, clearer now, carried on the spin of the air. He turned his head like a man following a bell. His boots scuffed forward. The dust opened like a doorway, and he walked in. When the truck was found 2 days later, it was still idling on the shoulder, tank empty, door hanging open. No sign of Billy. The sheriff's deputies chalked it up to another oilfield drifter walking away from his rig, maybe catching a ride, maybe worse. But the cab was odd. Every surface was coated with a fine layer of dust, except the driver's seat, which was spotless, as though someone had been sitting there the whole time. On the dash lay a strip of sun-faded paper, edges curled, with his name typed bold. The date made no sense. Too far back, too long gone. Truckers still talk about him. They say if you roll past Pyote late in the day when the sun's low and the ground's hot enough to shimmer, you might see a dust devil in your mirrors, following neat as a hound. Some men floor it. Some pray. A few claim they heard voices. In the wind, old debts, and half-forgotten songs. No one keys the mic, not anymore. The Eagle Ford doesn't sleep the way other parts of Texas do. Oil work runs around the clock, and I'd gotten used to the strange rhythms of it. The buzz of diesel engines in the distance at midnight. The hum of compressors kicking on and off. The low thunder of trucks rattling down FM roads while the rest of the county seemed dead. My shift at the Atascosa lease was one of those graveyard rotations nobody wanted but everyone took when it came around. I'd pull up in my beat-up F-150, check gauges, walk lines, make sure the place wasn't about to blow or spill, and ride. Out the night with thermos coffee and a burner phone my wife insisted I keep on me since reception out there was spotty. That phone was one of those $10 flip jobs from the gas station, the kind you load with minutes when you don't want AT&T billing you. I hardly used it except to call in if something broke bad. But a month into nights on that lease, the phone developed a habit. At 2:06 a.m. sharp, every night I worked, it rang. Caller ID, my own number. The first time I thought it was some glitch in the towers, signals crossing in the sticks. I opened it, and all I heard was wind, hissing and whispering like the same hot breeze that moved the mesquite around the tanks. I snapped it shut, muttered a curse, and thought no more of it, except it kept happening. Every night, always 2:06, always my own number on the screen, and always just that wind when I answered. No words, no static, just the hollow push of air like someone was breathing over the mic. I started leaving it to ring, but ignoring it made me feel worse, like if I didn't answer, something out there would think I was afraid. So I'd flip it open, press it to my ear, and listen to that ghost wind until it cut off. Then I'd put it back in my pocket and finish the shift with my skin crawling. My boy Daniel was 10. He loved when I came home at dawn, dust on my boots, and I'd ruffle his hair before he left for school. Sometimes he'd sneak out of bed just to ask me if I'd seen coyotes or owls, and I'd make up a little story to keep him smiling. He didn't know how bad the nights could feel, how lonely. He thought I was some cowboy in a hard hat chasing off varmints under the stars. That thought kept me steady most of the time, until the night the call changed. It was a Tuesday. I remember, because the foreman had chewed me out that afternoon for a minor spill and I was already raw. The lease was dead quiet. Cicadas long gone for the season, no crickets even. The burner rang, right on schedule, 2:06. I flipped it open, expecting wind. But instead I heard Daniel's voice, thin and scared, saying, "Dad, don't turn left." Froze. My chest locked up like someone had cinched a rope tight around me. I whispered his name, asked him what he meant, but the line cut off. Dead air. I closed the phone and stared at the dark spread of pump jacks and tanks, my own breath fogging in the night. I called home with my regular cell, praying he'd answer. But my wife picked up, groggy, telling me Daniel was asleep in his bed. She even went to check. He was fine, she said. She told me to stop working myself into paranoia. But his voice hadn't been a dream. I'd know it anywhere. And it was pleading. Warning. The next night, I almost didn't want to go in. But rent and groceries don't care about omens. So I drove the 30 miles out, headlights carving through scrubland, every shadow looking like it wanted to lean into the road. At 2:06, sure enough, the burner screamed in my pocket. I opened it, heart pounding. Wind again. Only this time, under the hiss. A shape of words, like someone trying to talk through a storm. Couldn't make them out. I snapped it shut, my hands, shaking so bad I spilled coffee on the console. My shift felt longer than my whole life. It got worse. The calls grew, layered, voices under the wind, more than one, sometimes muttering, sometimes sharp, like arguments chopped up by distance. One night I swore I heard my own voice on the line, laughing low. Another, I heard my wife crying. And then, again, Daniel. Always. Daniel whispering or calling, sometimes just my name. But it always circled back to the same words. Dad, don't turn left. By then, I'd stopped sleeping proper. I'd lie awake when I got home, staring at the ceiling fan, my mind gnawing on those words like a dog on a bone. What left? Which road? What was waiting there? I started paying attention on my drives. The county roads around the lease had plenty of turns, most of them caliche tracks leading into brush, gates chained off with no trespassing signs. But the main lease road had one sharp fork about 5 miles from the highway. Left led down into a low draw, some old pads long abandoned. Right took you back toward the asphalt. That left turn stuck in my mind like a thorn. On the 12th night, I gave in to the pull. When I reached the fork, I slowed. Dust rolled around my headlights. I sat there, hand on the wheel, Daniel's voice echoing in my skull. Don't turn, left. My palms were sweating, but I felt something under my ribs urging me anyway. I cranked the wheel. Gravel popped under my tires as I turned left. The road narrowed quick. Mesquite closing in, branches scraping my truck like fingernails. After a quarter mile, I saw lights ahead. Faint, yellow, bobbing. For a second, I thought it was another rig hand. Maybe an old lantern swinging. I slowed, rolled closer. The lights danced higher, weaving. Then I saw they weren't lanterns. They were headlights, hung 10 feet off the ground, glaring out of nothing. No truck, no poles. Just lights burning in midair, pointed straight at me. My engine stuttered, coughed. The burner phone rang, sharp and shrill in the cab. 2:06, though my dash clock read 2:09. Caller ID, my number. I couldn't answer, my hands wouldn't move. The lights bore down and I felt something pulling at me like a current, dragging me forward though my foot was hard on the brake. The phone kept ringing, the sound drilling through my skull. Then it stopped. Silence fell heavy. My truck shut, off. Headlights went black. And in that perfect dark, Daniel's voice whispered right next to my ear, not through the phone but inside the cab with me. Dad, don't turn left, I screamed. I don't remember shifting gears, but somehow I got the truck in reverse, fishtailed back down the caliche, and didn't stop until I hit the highway. My chest hurt and my eyes burned with tears I hadn't felt coming. The burner lay on the floorboard, dead screen staring up at me. It never rang again after that. Not once. I kept it for a while, afraid to throw it out. then buried it in a drawer under old receipts. The battery bloated, split the casing, and I tossed it finally, hands shaking like they had that first night. I still work nights now and then. You can't avoid them in this business, but I won't go back to that lease. And if I see a left turn, I take the long way around. My boy doesn't know about it, though sometimes he looks at me strange, like maybe he remembers saying something he shouldn't have. Like maybe, for a sliver of a second, something borrowed his voice to keep me alive. The Eagle 4 doesn't sleep, but sometimes I think it dreams, and I think those dreams are hungry. The pump jack stood out there in the mesquite like a broken monument, a steel skeleton against the flat horizon. I'd been tending wells near Pecos for years and knew every unit's quirks, the squeaks, the leaks, the way dust would settle in the bearings. But this one had been shut down a long time. The company welded its horsehead in place and tagged it with bright red "Do Not Operate" tape. A dead pump jack, the guys called it. Just another relic in a patch littered with half-buried pipe and old tin drums. But folks in the area said it wasn't dead, not really. That it moved at midnight just once, dipping low like it was still pulling oil from a formation long gone dry. I'd laughed when I first heard it. Machinery doesn't move without power, without human hands or pressure in the line. But the story clung to me, enough that one night I sat in my truck, engine off, and watched. The desert was black and endless, cicadas buzzing like static in my ears, the air dry and holding onto the heat from the day. Midnight slid in like a tide, and then I saw it. The horsehead dipped down slow and steady, a perfect pumping stroke. My breath caught because I knew that weld held. I'd seen it with my own eyes. The thing should have been locked solid, but it swung once, then stilled again, like nothing had happened. I sat there longer, my pulse hammering, but the motion didn't repeat. I told myself it was a trick of the eyes, a shift in shadows, maybe even heat rippling off the steel. Still, I drove home uneasy, replaying the image in my mind. The next night, I came back with my phone. I parked closer, set it to record, and waited. Midnight hit, and I leaned forward, staring through the windshield. Again, the horsehead dipped, breaking its welded rest as smooth as if some giant hand had set it free. I gripped the steering wheel hard and thought, got you this time. But when I played back the video later in my cab, my mouth went dry. There was no pump jack moving on the screen, no sweep of steel against the night. Just 3 minutes of me slumped against the driver's seat, eyes shut, breathing deep like I'd been asleep. I remembered being awake the whole time. I swore. I hadn't closed my eyes, not once. Yet the video insisted otherwise. The next morning I checked the unit, climbed up with my gloves and flashlight. The weld bead along the joint was cracked clean through, like something had pulled against it hard enough to shear the metal. I touched the brake and felt the sharpness bite through the glove, new and fresh. I reported it to the office, but the foreman just frowned and told me not to waste company time. "That jack's been dead since before you hired on," he said. "Don't go chasing ghost stories." But I couldn't leave it. I came back the next night, and the next. Each recording gave me the same result. Me, asleep and unguarded while the machine loomed silent behind. I stopped showing the clips around. Guys in the yard started to rib me, calling me dreamwalker, asking if I was taking naps instead of making rounds. What I didn't tell them was that each morning I woke with the taste of rust in my mouth and grit in my eyes, as if I'd been working in the dirt all night. My clothes smelled faintly of crude, even though I hadn't touched a wrench. One dawn I noticed boot prints around the unit that weren't mine. Deep impressions in the caliche, fresh enough the edges hadn't crumbled. They circled the jack, pacing like someone waiting. I squatted down and pressed my own boot beside one. The print was longer, broader, and sank deeper, like the man who left it had weight behind him far greater than he should. The next night, I parked even closer, rolled the window down to listen. The desert was still except for the occasional yap of a coyote. Midnight came. The pump jack moved again, slow, deliberate. This time the sound carried, a long creak of strained steel, not in my ears but deep in my chest. And then faint under the groan, a whisper. I froze, trying to catch it. The voice wasn't coming from the desert air, but from inside my own mask, as if the respirator hung in the cab had found lungs of its own. The words were muffled, pleading, repeating a rhythm I couldn't quite catch. I ripped the mask down and threw it on the seat beside me, but the whisper went on until the horsehead locked back into stillness. I drove home shaking, my phone still recording in the cup holder. The footage showed me with my head tilted back, mouth slack, eyes open this time but glazed, staring straight ahead. The whisper bled faint through the speaker, though I knew I hadn't spoken. I stopped sleeping much after that. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw the unit dipping, that impossible swing breaking the desert's silence. I started dreaming I was downhole, hundreds of feet under, crammed in with bones and old pipes, packed tight in mud that pressed against my chest until I couldn't breathe. I'd wake clawing the sheets, lungs burning. My girlfriend left after one too many nights of that. She said I smelled like oilfield death, whatever the hell that meant. I decided to end it. One evening I loaded cutting torches in the truck, told myself I'd burn the whole jack down to its legs. I drove out, headlights carving the lonely road, the sky bruised with heat lightning far to the south. When I reached the pad, I killed the engine and stepped into the desert silence. The unit loomed tall against the stars. I set the torch, sparked it alive, and went for the broken weld. That's when I heard it. Not a whisper, but a chorus. Dozens of voices rising from the sand, muffled and desperate, pushing against the dark. The ground trembled under my boots. The horsehead dipped before midnight, dragging the beam down like it was thirsty for something hidden deep below. I dropped the torch. Flames hissed out in the dirt. My phone lit up in my pocket, recording, without me touching it. I didn't take it out, didn't want to see what it would show this time. I stumbled back, staring as the pump jack groaned and settled again, steel shuddering like it had swallowed. The desert went silent. Too silent, the kind that makes you hear your own blood move. The next morning I drove past the site. The unit stood still, red tape fluttering in the breeze, weld seam unbroken. My torch lay melted near the base. But when I checked my phone, I found a new video waiting. 3 minutes again. My own face in the cab, but not sleeping this time. Awake, smiling faintly, lips moving in sync with that whisper I'd heard inside the mask. I watched in horror as I mouthed words I couldn't recognize, syllables wet and guttural. At the end, I leaned close to the lens, eyes black in the reflection, and said, clear as day, midnight's not for you anymore. I don't go back out there now, but I can't shake the pull. Some nights I wake at 12 iron sharp, standing in the yard without remembering leaving the bed, dust coating my hands. Out on the horizon, I swear I hear the creak of steel swinging, slow and steady, a dead pump jack feeding on something deeper than oil. And I know sooner or later, I'll follow the sound all the way back. The dunes at Monaghan stretch out like an ocean without water, all pale gold and shifting with the slightest breath of wind, each ridge shaped into something new by morning. I'd been working frack out there for months, bunking in a prefab man, camp that smelled of sweat, diesel, and fried bologna, and walking every day across the packed trail of sand that led from the trailers to where the trucks idled. It wasn't a place that felt alive, not the way a town or a pasture or even a mesquite windbreak might. Out there, the sand was everything. It swallowed sound, erased footprints by dusk, and crept into your lungs until you hacked grit into your palm. People said the dunes were haunted, but then again, in West Texas, everything older than a few decades seemed to carry a ghost story. I laughed at it most nights, until that morning. I left my bunk before dawn, boots unlaced, the sand cool under the dim glow of security lights. The wind was still unusual for Monaghan's, and I could hear the hiss of the highway in the distance, freight trucks rolling east toward Odessa. I remember smelling coffee and grease from someone's skillet, then nothing else but my own breath. I'd walked that same trail 50 times, always in a daze of fatigue, and it never felt like anything more than sand and silence. But that morning, my heel sank deeper than usual. I thought maybe I'd stepped on a soft spot, the kind where the Dunes had shifted overnight, and I cursed under my breath because I didn't want to arrive with half a boot filled. Only it didn't stop at my heel. My other foot sank, then both legs, and before I knew it, the ground gave way like quicksand and I dropped to my knees. The shock made me freeze. My thighs locked tight as I pushed upward, but the sand swallowed harder. By the time I tried to roll backward, my knees were buried, the grit clawing at my jeans, filling every seam. I hollered, thinking somebody might hear, but the camp was still behind me, the nearest rig half a mile off. I clawed at the sand, but it was loose, slipping back into the hole I made, piling onto me. That's when I felt it. Pressure against my boots, a push from below, like something alive was pressing upward from underneath. I kicked, hard, thinking maybe I'd stepped on some animal, a hog or stray dog that had burrowed in, but the pressure grew steady. I looked down, and for a second I couldn't breathe. The sand shifted, not just from me sinking, but from something else moving beneath me. And then another pair of legs appeared, pale against the grit, kicking like they were trying to climb out. They weren't mine. These were thinner, bare, thrashing, as if someone under the dune wanted my spot, like they meant to trade places with me. I screamed for help then, a sound that cracked my throat raw. My hands shook as I pulled at the sand, and my fingers grazed fabric, jeans but torn and rotted, the kind you'd see half buried in junk piles. I swear I felt muscle and bone beneath, cold as stone. I kept clawing, and the more I dug, the more the sand pressed, like it wanted both of us down there. My boots thrashed against those other legs, but they didn't stop moving. They twisted, bucked, fought upward with a strength that made my chest ice over. Whoever it was didn't want saving. They wanted out. By the time the rest of the crew heard me and ran, I was half under. My foreman, a thick man named Rojas, grabbed my arms and hauled me up with two others pulling at my shoulders. Sand rained off me as they cursed, heaving until my boots tore free. I collapsed face first into the grit, spitting and gagging, my chest aching. Behind me, the sand still shifted. One of the hands shouted, pointing down, and that's when they saw it too. The legs didn't vanish with me free. They kept thrashing, kicking hard enough to fling sand, knees bent, feet clawing for air like some drowned man fighting through water. We all watched, frozen, as the dune trembled. Then, in an instant, the sand smoothed over. The legs swallowed whole. No trace left but the shallow collapse where I'd fallen. Nobody said a word. We stood in a half circle, breathing like cattle after a run. Rojas was the first to move, spitting hard and cursing in Spanish, telling everyone to keep their mouths shut. "Ain't no story here," he barked. "Sand shifted, that's all. You talk different, you'll be walking." His eyes said more. He'd seen it plain as I had, but he wasn't about to let it spread. Men out here scared easy enough. The thought of something under the sand would keep them from coming to work. They dragged me back to camp and poured whiskey down me, told me I'd just panicked. I tried to believe it, until that night I woke coughing, spitting grit onto the floor beside my bunk. The sand didn't belong inside me, but there it was, damp with blood sticking to my teeth. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake listening to the showers running, though no one was inside. The sound of boots thumping in the hallway when every bed was full. By dawn, my legs ached deep. A soreness that felt less like strain and more like something pulling from within. A few days later, one of the roustabouts went missing. His name was Perez, young kid from El Paso. He was last seen walking the same path I had, headed toward the trucks at first light. They found his hard hat, but nothing else. No footprints, no struggle, just empty sand like the wind had scrubbed it clean. The company sent out a search party with dogs, but the hounds only whined and circled, tails tucked. They never barked. Rojas called it a runaway, said Perez probably caught a ride east. But his duffel was still under his bunk, his wallet on, the dresser. We all knew better. Men stopped walking the path alone after that. They went in pairs, and even then, some carried shovels like they could dig their way free if it happened again. Nights grew quiet, laughter gone from the trailers, radios playing low as if the sand might hear. More than once I woke to see dunes moving outside the window, not with the wind, but with some slow crawling shift that made my stomach lurch, like something was turning underneath. The worst part was the dreams. I'd see myself walking across the sand, only my body was empty. I'd sink to my knees and the other me would rise, grinning with my face but darker somehow, eyes hollow. I'd wake with my sheets wet, not from sweat, but with damp grit. The others noticed too. Men started finding sand in their boots, though they'd left them by the door. One swore he felt hands pulling at him when he bent to tie his laces. Rojas just glared, but his own boots stayed inside from then on. By the end of that month, 2 more hands vanished. No one saw, no one spoke of it loud, but the camp emptied faster than it filled. The company called it turnover, said frack always chewed men up. Maybe so, but I knew the sand had them. I could feel it every time I stepped outside, the ground just waiting, shifting, patient. The desert doesn't hurry. It's got all the time in the world. I put in my notice after the 3rd, packed my gear, climbed in my truck, and swore I'd never look back. But as I drove east on I-20, past the rolling dunes glowing pale in the sun, I saw a shape rise from the sand in my mirror. 2 legs kicking, thrashing in the glare, and then another pair beside them. My stomach twisted. The wind picked up, a wall of grit sweeping across the highway, and I lost sight of everything for miles. When it cleared, the dunes looked smooth again, empty, waiting. I haven't set foot near Monaghan since, but sometimes, even states away, I wake coughing sand. And when I close my eyes too long, I swear I feel another pair of legs pressing hard against mine, trying to climb their way up as if they're not done trading places. Orla is the kind of place you could pass 100 times on the way to Pecos or Kermit and never notice. Just a cluster of pump jacks, a few tank batteries, and trailers huddled under the weight of the West Texas sky. No town square, no courthouse, dome, not even a gas station left open after sundown. Just that stretch of gravel pads and lease roads spoking off from 285 like veins into the mesquite and caliche dust. So when I first saw the diner, I thought I was more tired than I knew. I'd been hauling sand since 3 in the afternoon, running back and forth between a pit outside Carlsbad and a frack site near Coyanosa, and by the time my clock rolled past midnight, my eyelids felt like lead weights. It was just past the Orla turnoff when a glow hit my windshield, too low and too steady to be a flare stack. Blue light, sharp as a bug zapper's crackle, spilling across the gravel like a sheet of neon water. The diner sat on a pad, I swore, hadn't been there the day before. A silver trailer cafe, long as 2 double wides welded nose to nose with glass windows fogged from inside, and a crooked sign that read, Orla's Blue Flame. The letters were painted by hand, white against a cobalt background, and the only sound was the high hum of the bug zappers strung along the awning. The pad was full of trucks, though I hadn't passed a soul in miles. Kenworths, Peterbilts, beat-up F-250s, even a flatbed loaded with rusted drill pipe. Every rig had dust on its hood like they'd been sitting a while, but there were Buddha. Tracks in the gravel and the smell of hot fry oil bleeding through the night. I told myself I'd just stop for coffee. That's all. Get a mug of black strong enough to burn my tongue and keep me awake the last leg home. I walked through the glass door, and the bell above it chimed like an old cash register. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with cigarette smoke, though no one held a cigarette. The booths were full, every seat taken, and the counter had 3, stools left open as if they'd been waiting for me. The smell of fresh pie was thick enough to choke. Everyone inside wore the same patch. It was sewn on coveralls, denim jackets, pearl snap shirts, blue and white, a flame curling around a derrick and the words, Blue Flame Energy embroidered in red. I knew the patch. I'd seen it once in an old storage shed my uncle kept back in Jal, New Mexico. He'd worked a contract with them in the late 80s, a company that folded before I was born. But here it was, as if the whole crew had walked out of 1988 and sat down for midnight coffee. The waitress slid up before I could sit. Her name tag said D, but the plastic was yellowed, cracked at the corner. She smiled, the kind of smile you practiced once and wore forever, and poured me a mug without asking. The coffee was dark and steaming, and when I took a sip, it tasted like my grandmother's percolator, bitter and perfect. "Long haul tonight?" she asked, her voice low and steady, like she'd asked it 1,000 times. "Carlsbad to Koyanosa," I said, and the men in the booths all nodded like they knew the route by heart. One of them raised his mug. His knuckles were scarred, fingers curled from some long-heeled break. "Watch for blowouts this week," he said, voice dry as caliche dust. "Road's gonna take more than tires." They laughed then, soft and knowing, and I couldn't tell if it was a joke. I ate a slice of pie I didn't order. It showed up in front of me. Cherry. The crust, still warm, sugar crystals glittering under the lights. I ate every bite without meaning to. And the whole time the jukebox in the corner played the same song I'd heard 100 times on oldies radio. Some late 80s country ballad that had no right sounding fresh. The singer's voice as clear, as if he was still alive. When I left, the gravel pad was quiet. The truck still sat lined like tombstones, but the night had a weight to it. A silence so thick I thought I might choke on it. I climbed back into my rig and rolled south. And when I stopped at the yard outside Odessa an hour later, I noticed something stitched onto my jacket. The patch, blue flame curling around a derrick. The red letters burned into the denim like they'd always been there. I told myself I must have leaned against a decal, or someone played a prank at the pad. I peeled it off with my pocket knife, left a ragged hole in the jacket, and threw the patch in the yard dumpster. But the next morning it was back. Clean, neat, perfectly sewn where it had been, not a thread out of place. Over the next week I asked around. Old hands remembered blue flame energy. They ran rigs all across the Delaware Basin in the 80s, a shoestring outfit trying to keep up with the majors, until an H2S blowout near Orla killed 24 men. Some said the whole crew was buried where they fell. Gravel poured over the well pad and the trailers hauled away. No one could tell me for sure. The records vanished when the company folded, and the pad was long since gone to mesquite and rust. I tried not to stop again. I kept my eyes on the highway, hands tight on the wheel, but the glow was always there, waiting. Sometimes it was close, sometimes miles off, flickering blue against the horizon like heat lightning. Twice I found myself pulling in without remembering the turn. The coffee was always hot, the pie fresh, and every man inside wore that patch. They nodded when I walked in, smiled when I sat, like I'd always been one of them. The last time I went, the counter was full. Only one seat left. Dee poured my coffee and leaned close enough that her breath warmed my ear. "It's better if you don't fight it," she whispered. And for the first time I saw the skin at her throat ripple like heat off asphalt. The lines of her face not set but shifting, like something beneath was trying to come through. I left my mug half full, pie untouched, and stumbled into the night. The bug zappers hissed, their light sharp and cold, and I swear I heard voices in the hum, names called in a drawl I almost recognized, laughter from men I'd never met. The next morning the patch wasn't on my jacket, it was on my skin, inked just above the heart. The red letters raw and swollen like a fresh burn. I scraped until I bled, but it stayed, the blue flame curling no matter how deep I cut. Now every night I see the glow, sometimes in my mirrors, sometimes reflected in the chrome of the dash. The diner waits, patient and hungry, and I know it, won't stop until I sit down for good. I don't haul sand anymore, I don't haul anything. I keep driving circle after circle through the basin, because I know if I park too long, if I close my eyes more than a few minutes, I'll wake up at that counter with a hot mug and a slice of cherry pie, nodding along with the crew, my patch stitched tight, sewn into the fabric of men who never left 1988. The foreman told himself he'd been staring at sun-baked caliche too long, that the heat had cooked his brain and his eyes were tricking him, but no matter how many times he blinked or rubbed his lids, the picture didn't change. The tank battery was gone. He parked his pickup on the shoulder of the lease road, dust curling off the tires, and stepped out into the dry Fort Stockton wind that rattled mesquite pods like bones. The square pad was still there, perfectly leveled, edged neat and sharp the way a dozer had cut it, but where 3 silver tanks, a separator and a heater treater should have been, there was nothing but emptiness. No footprints, no tracks, no cut bolts or hauled off scrap. It was as if someone had slipped a spatula under the whole steel assembly and lifted it into the sky. He spat, the grit of caliche dust between his teeth, and walked the pad slow, boot soles crunching on the pale ground. He touched the risers that stuck out of the pad, sheared clean, like something sharp had sliced through instead of a wrench. He crouched, ran his finger along the end of a pipe and found it warm, slick with something that wasn't oil. It was water, faintly salty, dripping steady, fresh enough to darken the dirt at his boots. He stood up quick and scanned the horizon. West, the glass mountains shimmered in heat waves. East, the power lines sagged toward town. South, the caliche road ran straight until it disappeared. And north into the shallow draw he saw the dark green of a mesquite grove where no grove had any business growing so thick. The drips trailed that way, little spots dappling the caliche, disappearing into the brush. The foreman felt his skin crawl like ants had gotten under it, but he was a man used to busted rods, sour tanks, rattlers under the skids. He didn't spook easy. Still, there was something about the silence that made him pause. Normally, the pad hummed with flies, the whisper of fluid and steel, the groan of windmill blades out on the ranches. Now it was just the dry moan of wind, and under that, nothing. He pulled his ball cap lower and followed the drips. The mesquite grove rose up in front of him, limbs twisted like black claws, leaves clattering. As he stepped in, the light dimmed, the air cooler. The smell was wrong. Steel and heat mixed with something metallic like blood dried in the sun. And then he heard it, faint at first, like distant thunder, then sharper, clearer, steel settling, groaning high above him. He froze, tilted his head back, and the sound came again, the unmistakable ping of hot steel cooling, shifting, like tanks left out in the sun. But there were no tanks. The sky was pale, wide open, nothing hanging there except a vulture turning, lazy circles. Still the sound came right over the tops of the mesquite, echoing in a way that made his stomach tighten. He backed up a step, boot catching on a root, and nearly went down. The drips had thickened here, splashing on leaves, staining bark with streaks of salt water. He reached out to steady himself on a trunk, and his palm came away wet. He looked down. The liquid wasn't just water. It was darker, a brackish mix. And as the wind shifted, he caught the smell of crude and something rancid. His radio crackled in his shirt pocket, sudden enough to make him jump. Static hissed, then a voice, thin and warped, called his name. Not his last name, not the one men used on sight, but his first name, the way his mother used to say it when she wanted his attention. He yanked the radio out, thumbed the button, but only static answered, broken with faint clanging like chains swaying in wind. He dropped it back, heart punching in his chest. The steel above groaned again, louder, like weight shifting on beams. He squinted, and for just a second he swore he saw shadow blot the sky, round and massive like something overhead was blotting the sun. But then it was gone, leaving only the spinning vulture and the white glare. He tried to steady his breath, told himself maybe he was heat-struck, but the grove didn't let him out. He walked deeper, drips leading him in, branches catching his shirt. The ground dipped, soft and damp where no rain had fallen in weeks. He looked down, and there, half buried in the loam, was a steel ladder, the kind bolted to a tank's side, twisted, bent. The rungs sunk into dirt like it had dropped from a height. He crouched, touched it. The metal was warm, too warm for shade. Something whined high above him, a mechanical whir, faint but steady. He craned his neck until it ached, eyes watering from the glare. And again he thought he saw movement. An edge of something too straight to be a cloud, glinting like metal in sunlight, then sliding behind a veil of heat shimmer. His mouth went dry. He knew rigs, knew equipment, knew what belonged in West Texas sky, and that wasn't it. A deep groan rolled down from above like the bowels of a ship settling at sea, and with it came a rain of droplets pattering on mesquite leaves, splattering his face. He wiped his cheek and stared at his hand. Not water. Oil. Thin and black, running down his fingers. The radio spat again, loud in the hush. and the same voice said his name once more, softer now, drawn out, almost pleading. He backed away from the ladder, boots squelching in damp dirt, eyes darting between the dripping shadows and the pale sky. Something huge shifted up there. He could feel it in his gut, a pressure in the air like when a storm brews just out of sight. The branches rattled though the wind had gone still. His truck was 200 yards back down the road, but the way out seemed longer, darker, the grove pressing closer around him. He turned, forced himself to walk fast, not run, though every nerve in him screamed to. Behind him the groan of steel, carried, followed by a sound like bolts snapping one after another. The dripping quickened, heavy now, pouring, pattering through the trees as if a tank overhead had sprung a seam. He didn't look back. He broke into a run when the static chased him, a rising howl from the radio, mixed with voices, layered, dozens, maybe hundreds men calling out, cursing, screaming, all warped through the thin speaker. The mesquite thrashed as he burst out into the light, stumbling onto the caliche road, breath tearing his lungs. The pad was still empty, perfectly square, silent, blank. But above it, where sky should have been only sky, the light bent, shimmered, like heat off asphalt, but thicker, a haze that held shape. He staggered to his truck, flung himself into the cab, slammed the door and turned the key. The engine coughed, caught, roared. He threw it into gear, tires spitting white dust, and didn't stop until the mesquite and the pad were small in the rear view. Only then did he risk a glance up through the windshield. The haze had followed, stretched thin across the blue, and the groaning steel still whispered just at the edge of hearing. And in the back seat his radio hissed with static. Then a new voice. Not his mother's this time, but his own, calm and flat, saying words he hadn't spoken. The message was simple, delivered in his voice. You saw us. Now you'll come back. He drove harder, past the pump jacks, past the windmills, the heat shimmer rising off the asphalt like a veil. But no matter how far he put between himself and the grove, the sky above Fort Stockton seemed a little lower, a little darker, as if something vast hung there, waiting. The coil tubing rig sat half on the shoulder, half on the dirt, its hazard lights blinking orange against the twilight. The air smelled of hot diesel and creosote fence posts, and a low wind carried the dry tang of mesquite dust across Ranch, Road 33. Traffic was light, just the occasional ranch pickup grumbling by or a cattle hauler pushing toward San Angelo. Most drivers slowed when they saw the rig pulled over, but they didn't stop. Folks out here knew better than to involve themselves with oil field breakdowns after dark. That was crew business, not neighborly business. I was leaning against my service truck, wiping grease off my hands with an old rag when the rattle started. At first I thought it was a water moccasin curled under the frame, or maybe a rattler that had slithered too close to the warm idle of the Cummins. It had that quick, bone-dry cadence like seeds shaken in a gourd. But it didn't fade in or out the way a snake's tail does. It ticked sharp and steady, like something mechanical. The rig hands had gone quiet. They stood near the work lights, silhouettes against the flat horizon, watching me like I was the only one with the right to get close. I didn't blame them. Coiled tubing rigs are finicky bastards, and when something starts making a noise that doesn't belong, it can mean hours of hell. But this wasn't the kind of rattle that belonged to hydraulics or bearings. It was tighter, sharper, intimate in a way that felt wrong. I crouched by the hood, listening. The rattle was coming from inside the engine bay, from somewhere near the serpentine belt. A snake would have slithered back by then, sensing the vibration. Whatever this was, it wanted to be heard. I popped the hood latch. The metal groaned up on its hinges, and the sound hit me full in the chest. A constant clicking, fast and deliberate, like teeth chattering against cold air. I leaned in, flashlight beam cutting across hoses, belts, and radiator fins. Nothing moved except the regular rhythm of pistons under steel. Yet the sound grew louder, clustered at the center like a heartbeat. I reached in. The clicking grew frantic. My fingers brushed something smooth and hard, not rubber, not steel. I pulled back quick, heart lurching. The others shifted uneasily, boots scraping caliche. I swallowed, took a breath, and grabbed again. When my hand came out, I was holding a handful of teeth. Human teeth, small and perfect, each one white as porcelain, roots clean and dry. They clattered against each other in my palm, clicking like a nest of beetles. I dropped them onto the dirt, but they didn't scatter like rocks. They held together, jaws with no flesh, molars grinding against incisors, the sound rising into something hungry. The men cursed softly. One crossed himself. Another spat into the dirt and muttered about brujas. I told them to step back. The teeth kept clicking, lining themselves into a row as if forming something unseen. Then, as quickly as it had started, they went still. The silence that followed was worse. The wind died down, the cicadas hushed. Even the engine seemed to idle quieter. We stood in that unnatural calm, watching the pile of teeth like it might rear up. Then the rattle started again, inside the hood. I swung my light back in, but the engine bay was empty. The sound wasn't echoing from metal. It was inside the block itself, deep in the iron. Clicking teeth under the valve cover, teeth where there should only be oil and fire. That was when the crew boss, a weathered man named Ortega, told me the story. He spoke low so only I could hear. Said that stretch of Ranch Road 33 had been cursed since a bus crash back in the 50s. A school bus headed for a football game, 22 kids lost when it flipped into the draw. He swore their bodies had been recovered, but not all of them whole. Teeth scattered everywhere, shining in the caliche like hailstones. He'd heard older hands say the ground swallowed what was left and spat it back into engines, chewing up anyone unlucky enough to stop here. I wanted to call it nonsense. Old men tell stories, and West Texas has more ghosts than windmills if you believe every tale. But the teeth in the dirt weren't stories. They were real, and they had moved. We got the rig started again, though none of us felt right about it. I made sure the bay was clear, slammed the hood, and told Ortega to keep moving until San Angelo. He nodded, pale under the work lights, and climbed into the cab. As they rolled off, taillights shrinking into the night, I gathered my tools. The teeth were gone. The dirt was bare except for my boot prints. Driving back alone, I kept hearing the sound. A dry, rapid ticking under my own hood, faint but steady. I told myself it was nerves, phantom noise after a long night. But as I pulled into my yard, cut the engine, and opened the door, the sound followed. Not from the truck anymore. From the shadows of the tool shed, from the mesquite at the fence line, from somewhere deep in my own head. Clicking, clean and deliberate, like a row of porcelain teeth working against each other in the dark. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear it waiting, hear it. South of Sonora, the land turns to a hard scrub. Miles of mesquite and cedar stumps with limestone showing through like bone. The highways run straight until they don't, and on some nights the desert plays tricks on you with the light. I was part of a line crew driving back from a maintenance job, tired as hell just wanting to make Sonora before midnight. We were 5 men in a company truck, 2 in the front, 3 crammed in the back. The kind of silence that comes after 12 hours in the sun with only the rattle of tools left in your ears. That's when we saw them. At first I thought it was the white posts catching the high beams like the reflectors they sometimes hammer into the shoulder. But as we rolled closer, it became clear that the center stripe was lined, perfectly, with jackrabbits. Hundreds of them, maybe 1,000, all crouched along the yellow paint. They weren't scattered, weren't grazing or darting, just pressed still as fence posts, ears tall, bodies taut. Every one of them pointed south like they were watching something beyond the reach of the lights. We slowed because you don't just plow into a wall of bone and fur. Not out here where things already seem fragile enough. Their eyes reflected silver but dead somehow. Not the wild sparkle you see when they scatter in the beam. We crept forward at 5 miles an hour, the tires whispering, the rabbits giving us the aisle like we were royalty on a parade. Nobody said a word, except one of the guys in the back let out a dry chuckle that died quick when no one joined him. Tew. Line stretched on, a mile at least, maybe more, a living divider between lanes. They didn't flinch, didn't twitch, didn't even breathe as far as I could tell. just row after row, watching south, ears catching the same invisible sound. I kept expecting the crunch of bone under rubber, but the lane was clear. The rabbits exact as though placed there by survey crew. It wasn't until we reached the end, when the yellow broke to white and the last of them crouched like a sentry, that we realized how much we'd been holding our breath. I hit the gas harder than I meant to, the truck lurching forward like it wanted free of something. Someone muttered a curse, someone else whispered a prayer. We didn't talk about it because there wasn't language for it. 5 minutes later, though, the radio crackled and one of the boys said, "Rear cam's gone fuzzy." I tapped the dash, checked the feed. Static cleared and the road behind shimmered with dust. The rabbits were gone. Every single one. But the dust didn't settle like it should. Something was moving in it. A figure. Maybe two. Sitting right in the middle of the asphalt where the rabbits had been, cross-legged, small as a child. The dust caught their teeth first, the way the headlights did. A bright grin too wide, too steady, holding there like paint on glass. My stomach flipped because it wasn't just smiling, it was waiting. The feed cut black. We said nothing the rest of the drive, not even when the road turned and Sonora's lights showed ahead like a handful of nails spilled across the hills. The next morning, when we checked the truck in daylight, the rear camera lens was scratched deep, like something with 1,000 tiny claws had raked across the glass. And there in the truck bed, where our hard hats and harnesses lay, were rabbit tracks pressed into the dust, not hopping, not scattered, but lined neat in a row, facing south. That was the last time I rode that stretch at night, but sometimes when I'm out in the yard past dark, when the mesquite shadows lie long and the dogs go quiet, I swear I hear the shuffle of paws in perfect cadence, and I remember that smile sitting in the dust, waiting for us to pass again. And I can't shake the thought that maybe we weren't the ones traveling that highway at all. Maybe we were just driving through something else's parade, and one night it'll decide the mile's not long enough. Lease 47 was the kind of place you only ended up at if the company ran out of better assignments or you had pissed somebody off. It sat at the end of a caliche road that had no name on the county maps, just a number penciled in on some oil company, Platt. Past scrubby mesquite and a handful of cattle tanks gone dry, the gate rose up out of the dust like something out of a bad dream. 12 feet of chain link topped with spirals of razor wire, a keypad welded to a steel post beside it. The yard code didn't matter. Everyone in the yard had heard it. 4 zeros, 4 nines, 4 sevens, whatever you punched, the green light always came on. But the keypad had one extra feature, a dull metal plate under the numbers the size of a man's hand. That was the part nobody liked to talk about. The first day for the new guy was hotter than hell. West Texas August, sun bouncing off the hood of his truck hard enough to cook the paint. His name was Devin, 23, straight out of Odessa College. He'd laughed when the driller told him about the gate. What, like a sci-fi movie? It wants a handprint? He punched in 1, 2, 3, 4 and slapped his palm down. The gate groaned, slid open slow as molasses. Devin grinned, but when he pulled his hand back, something stayed behind. A faint, wet impression, like his palm had been pressed into damp clay, still pushing back even as he held his real hand in the air. It didn't fade. It didn't drip. It just clung to the plate, fingers flexing once as if waving goodbye. Devin's grin slipped. The driller spat in the dust and muttered, "Told you." The lease itself was nothing much, just a pair of pump jacks, a separator, and 2 stock tanks that leaned like tired drunks. The smell of crude hung heavy even on still days, and when the wind picked up, it carried a sour stink like rotten eggs. The crew worked their shifts, kept their heads down, and never lingered at the gate. Old-timers said Lease 47 wasn't supposed to be in service anymore, that the company had decommissioned it a decade back after a blowout, but somebody upstairs had turned the pumps back on. Nobody wanted to ask why. Devin kept bringing it up, though. He swore when he drove back through at the end of that first day the handprint was still there and it wasn't his anymore. Bigger, broader, with a scar crossing the palm. He said he pressed his hand again and felt heat rising from the metal like a living thing. The others told him to shut up, drink his beer, and let it go. Lease talk had a way of getting inside your head, and once it did, you couldn't shake it. By the second week, Devin had stopped laughing. He'd gone pale under his ball cap, eyes darting every time they neared the gate. He started wearing gloves even in the heat, swore he felt the plate tug when he laid his palm down. Said it didn't just take a print, it took something else. The pumper tried to calm him, but the truth was everyone felt it in their own way. A pulling in the chest, a drag in the bones, like stepping too close to a high-voltage line. The palm plate didn't care what code you punched. It wanted the press of flesh, the stamp of life. One night, coming off a turnaround, Devin didn't show up at the diner in town. The foreman figured he'd gone home, maybe chasing girls, but by morning his truck was still parked at lease 47 just inside the gate, keys in the ignition, driver's side door open, boots on the caliche, one tipped over like he'd stepped out mid-stride. They searched the pad, the tanks, the mesquite. Nothing. Sheriff wrote it off as a walk-off, another young hand too green to stick it out. But the crew knew better, because when they drove out the next shift, the palm print on the metal plate had changed again. No longer scarred, no longer broad. It was smooth-skinned, calluses just forming. Devin's hand, down to the faint half-moon, scar where he'd cut himself changing a belt his first week. The foreman ordered the crew to stop touching it, but the gate wouldn't open unless someone did. Didn't matter what digits you pressed, that wasn't the bargain. The first week after Devin, they drew straws. Big Henry Lost pressed his paw down with a muttered curse. The gate opened, but Henry swore he felt something squeeze back. When he pulled away, his palm burned like frostbite, though the skin showed no mark. By the time he got home that night, he couldn't close his hand all the way. Said it felt like somebody else was holding it shut. Little things started piling up. Glove prints in the caliche dust around the separator, even when no one was there. Tools shifting, laid out in neat rows that nobody claimed credit for. Night pumpers swore they saw figures at the gate, pale shapes waiting patiently just beyond the reach of the floodlights, always with their hands out. The company told them to quit the stories, keep the oil flowing. So they did. But they avoided the gate, eyes down, palms pressed quick, never lingering to see what print stared back at them. A month later, Henry disappeared too. He was on nights, radioed once at 1 a.m. to say the pump was cycling funny. By morning, the separator was still running, lights blazing, and his truck sat idle at the pad. Door open, coffee cup still steaming, in the holder. No Henry. At the gate, the palm print had changed again. Broader than Devin's, rougher with a busted knuckle and a missing pinky tip. Exactly Henry's. After that, the rest of the crew started finding excuses. Sick calls, transfers, some flat out quitting the oil field altogether. The foreman himself lasted until winter. He was a stubborn man, the kind who'd hauled rods since the 60s, who laughed at rattlesnakes and worked through heat stroke. But the gate wore him down. He told his wife one night he dreamed of hands pressing through his chest, pushing his lungs flat, leaving his own palms bloody inside out on the sheets. 2 days later, his truck was found idling at lease 47. Cab light on, driver's side empty. His print stayed behind too, pressed on the plate forever. By then, the company had trouble keeping lease 47 staffed. They cycled in contractors, one after another, men from Houston, San Angelo, even out-of-staters desperate for the pay. None lasted more than a season. Some left screaming about hands pulling at them in the dark, others just gone without a trace. Every time, the palm plate filled itself with new prints, layer on layer, pressing back at whoever dared touch it next. Some nights you could swear the whole metal plate writhed, 100 hands shifting beneath the surface like fish in a bucket. Now lease 47 sits quiet most nights, pumps still nodding though nobody clocks in. Locals say the company switched it, fully automated, no human needed. But every so often a truck rolls out that way. Some contractor who doesn't know the stories yet. And you can hear the gate grind open, chain links rattling in the wind. They say if you pull over on the road and wait, you'll see the plate gleam under the floodlights, and the handprint there won't be yours or mine. It'll be a whole crowd of palms pressing from the other side, waiting their turn. The worst part? Folks who worked lease 47 and made it out still swear their hands don't feel right. Too heavy, too cold, or like they belong to someone else entirely. And sometimes, when they touch glass or metal, their own prints don't fade. They stay there, pushing back, as if the gate never let them go. The turnaround in Big Spring was one of those jobs where everybody felt ground down before it even started. They'd rented out the fellowship hall of a Baptist church to bunk 20 men, all laid out in rows of cots under the humming fluorescent lights. The rec hall smelled of dust, old varnish, and industrial coffee, but it was free and it was close to the refinery. Everyone figured they could handle it for a week or two. The preacher, an old man with a polite drawl and tired eyes, gave them the kind of welcome speech you'd expect. Keep your boots clean inside, no beer on church grounds, lights out by 10 if you can manage it. The men nodded along, hardly listening because all they wanted was a few hours sleep before the night shift. The first strange thing happened at 3 in the morning. A hymn started up in the sanctuary, not faint like a radio or somebody, singing in their sleep, but full-bodied with organ accompaniment and voices layered in harmony. Only there was no choir scheduled, no service at that hour, and when a couple of the younger guys pushed open the double doors to peek inside, the sanctuary was empty, pews dark and bare, altar lights out. The sound cut off as soon as the door hinges groaned, leaving nothing but the tick of the exit signs. They came back pale and quiet, pretending it was just some recording on a timer, but everybody in the rec hall had heard it, even the ones who pretended to stay asleep. By dawn, the preacher came around with a metal coffee urn moving cot to cot. His words were casual, but his eyes were off, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He said there would be service at sunrise, whether or not they cared to join. He said it like an order, not an invitation. The men joked about it over paper cups of weak coffee, but nobody laughed much. The refinery shift swallowed them up, 12 hours of heat and hammering metal, and by the time they got back to the hall, most of them just collapsed. But before lights out, someone noticed the whiteboard at the front of the room. Where yesterday, it had listed emergency contact numbers. Now it bore a single line of text in dry erase marker, John 29:13. There is no John 29:13. Everyone knew that, even the men who hadn't cracked a Bible in years. They stood around staring at it, some with unease, some with irritation, until a foreman wiped it off with his sleeve. Only, when the marker dust cleared, there was still writing underneath, faint but legible, like it had bled into the glossy surface. And the words weren't scripture. They were names, one after another, written in a hand that matched none of theirs. Every man who slept in that hall was listed, first and last name, neat as a roll call. The oldest hand on the crew swore it looked like someone had traced the letters with their fingertip instead of a pen. Another said his name had been there before he even walked in. They argued until the foreman snapped at them to quit spooking themselves. But when the lights clicked off, nobody slept well. They listened for the hymns, straining against silence, until at last, as the first gray light seeped under the blinds, the voices rose again, louder than before, calling names one by one like verses in a song. That second night, nobody tried to open the sanctuary doors. By the third, a few refused to bed down at all, choosing instead to drink coffee and play cards until sunrise. The preacher showed up again just after 4, asking why they hadn't attended the service. His tone had shifted, more forceful, eyes sharp as broken glass. One of the men asked him who was singing. The preacher only said, "It's not for me to tell you, son. You'll hear your place soon enough." Then he left, and the men sat in silence, each nursing his own dread. By Thursday, the whiteboard had changed again. Not only names now, but dates. 3 of the men saw their birthdays listed. 2 others saw dates that hadn't come yet. When the shift bus pulled up, those men didn't climb aboard. They muttered excuses, claimed they were sick, but everybody knew it was fear. By quitting time, they were gone. Cots still rumpled, boots still lined up under bunks, but no sign of the men themselves. The preacher came by after dark, smiling too wide, and said the Lord had called them home. No one challenged him. The work dragged on, and the list on the whiteboard grew. Names ticked off one by one with a faint gray smudge, as if erased with spit. Each erasure matched a missing man. Nobody wanted to believe it, but by the second weekend, the crew was down by half. The remaining men were gaunt, hollow-eyed, working like automatons by day and pacing the rec hall by night. Every sunrise brought another hymn, fuller and richer, and more pews creaked in the sanctuary, though no one was inside. The preacher's voice carried loudest, rolling like thunder between verses. Sometimes the men swore they could hear their own names sung from the rafters, not just spoken but sung in harmony, stretched into melody like a dirge. One of the last nights, the foreman snapped. He grabbed a hammer from his tool bag and marched to the sanctuary doors, swearing he'd put an end to the nonsense. He slammed the doors open. The men followed, unable not to. The pews were filled to the walls. Every man who had gone missing sat there, upright and stiff, dressed in their work clothes but pale as paper, mouths open in song. Their voices blended with something deeper, a sound like the turning of earth and the groan of steel. At the pulpit stood the preacher, both hands raised, and behind him the cross glowed with no light they could name. The foreman dropped his hammer. It rang loud and flat on the floor, but the men in the pews didn't look up, didn't blink. They just sang, and as the foreman's name rolled from their mouths, he staggered forward like pulled by strings. The rest ran. Some made it back to their cots, some didn't. By dawn, all who remained were listed in gray smudges on the whiteboard. The hall smelled of hymnals, of dust, of something sweet and rotten. The preacher never spoke to them again. The church doors locked from the inside, and when the refinery called to ask where the crew had gone, no one answered. The sanctuary was silent then, but if you pressed your ear to the stained glass window, you could still hear a low hum. Not words anymore, but the vibration of names without breath. Years later, when another crew came through Big Spring, they bunked in motels, no questions asked. The church still stood, doors bolted, whiteboard leaning face in against the wall. A neighbor swore sometimes she saw light flickering through the frosted windows at dawn. She swore she could hear voices, young and strong, lifting up a hymn that never ended. They sent us down a caliche road south of Carrizo Springs where the mesquite leans like tired men, and the prickly pear holds dust the way old books hold smoke. 3 vibro-sized trucks in a line, white paint scuffed to primer on the bumpers. Dim it, imaging stenciled in fading red on the doors. We rolled out at 4 with the moon like a quiet dime over the brush and a little wind that smelled of creosote posts and diesel. I was running the monitor in the doghouse on the back of the lead truck, a cramped aluminum closet with 2 racked screens and a desk gouged by coffee mugs and box cutters. We were chasing a stubborn formation a geophysicist out of San Antonio swore would look like a ladder on the profiles if we could lay enough pressure on the plate and run the sweeps long. We worked a line the surveyor had flagged with pink tape from Highway 83 past Catarina, through a ranch that had its gates strung, with bottle art crosses and a low wall of stacked limestone. The rancher met us at the first gate with a sour look and a thermos, boots powdered white, jaw chewing hard. He signed, he took his access money, and he told us to watch for his cattle and to shut the gates behind us and not to leave anything lit that shouldn't be. His name was Trevino, and he said if we saw a windmill with green blades to drive on because that pasture wasn't ours. He said it like a warning, not logistics. The first base plate dropped at 442. Lalo ran the pad, down and eased the hydraulic lever until 30,000 pounds of steel kissed caliche so firmly, the truck settled an inch. Alma checked the geophones, strings of them hammered into the soil at measured offsets, wires snaking like ants. She tapped each string and watched the confirmation blip. It felt normal, the way mornings feel in that part of Texas. Cold, seeping. Up through the boots, nighthawk skimming, a faint sour whiff from a flare stack miles off. I cued the sweep, a linear from 8 to 120, 20 seconds, 4 repeats with short breaks, and the trucks hummed into it, a vibration not sound. At first, the plate speaking through dirt. Seismic work is patient work until it isn't. You stare at scrolling wiggles, you mark your headers, you sip coffee gone the temperature of brown tap water. and once in a while you see something the ground shouldn't be doing. On the second repeat, Alma leaned into the doghouse and pressed her finger against the glass just below the waterfall display. "What's that low frequency?" she said. "That's not our sweep." I saw it too. A regular swell under everything, like someone knocking on the floor of the world from the crawl space. It was distinct, close to 1 hertz, a slow bump that wasn't our trucks. The sweep ran at a controlled shake. This was a thump with soft shoulders, and the correlator printed little twins of it far down the time axis where noise usually lives. "Probably generator," Lalo said over the radio. "One of y'all got a vibration on a loose panel." I killed my own generator for the doghouse and listened. The truck still hummed their controlled song, but the ground began to say thump in a separate rhythm. The coffee in my cup ringed once, not from the truck but from the earth. The sensation came through my boots, heel to shin, and laid a finger on my sternum like someone timing me with a metronome. The handheld bled a ribbon of static, a wind pearl that is normal for radios out there because the world is empty enough to hear electricity loose in the air. In that static sat a word with the weary patience of something that has said the same thing a long time and expects to be ignored. "Stop," it said. A low voice without being bass, a tired voice without being old. I looked at Alma, because I thought Lalo was playing with us. She looked past me at the speaker as if it might be a throat. "Lalo," she said, "you mess with the radio again. I'm driving a geophone stake under your nail." "Wasn't me," Lalo said, and he didn't sound like a liar just then. We cut the sweep and lifted the plates. The engines idled. We stood in the pre-dawn quiet broken by insects and the far-off rush of a truck on 83. The ground thumped twice with no help from us. A cow lowed from a dark clump of mesquite, spooked, and something small ran with a patter in the brush. "Maybe a pump," I said, though there was no pump jack near enough to carry through soil like that. Alma shook her head. "We're on an old line from the 50s, she said. "The San Antonio guy said if we see crazy things we note them, but we keep to the plan. He said anomalies are data." I noted it. Shot .127. Uncontrolled. Low-frequency energy. Audible voice in handheld requesting we stop operations. I wrote it like a joke to keep it light in my head, but joking didn't move that slow thump out of my blood. We went to the next flag. Dawn pinked the low cloud. We dropped the plates again, and the heartbeat came through stronger, our screens laying its shape in a smeared stack that defied the pretty interference patterns geophysicists love. Lalo tried the radio again, keying without talking, then talking without keying. Static sighed, and then between its grains the word came again. "Stop." I've heard ranchers mess with oilfield hands on radios, kids who get bored and think it's funny to cuss at strangers. But this was not that. There was a cadence to it like a single word spoken at the end of a held breath. It never wrote our transmission. It only lived in the in-between when no one keyed. Lalo said he was going to take a leak. I watched him walk off into the brush and come right back out, fly half open. "The ground is soft that way," he said wide-eyed. "Like a trampoline." It started pushing against my boots. We finished our 4 repeats and rolled forward. Trevino watched us from a gate with his thermos in his grip. He didn't raise it like a hello or a goodbye. He watched with his head, a little cocked as if listening to the same thing we were. At shot .132, Alma's screen did a thing I've never seen. The correlated trace drew an artifact bright and narrow, and it ran like a tail down past 6 seconds as if something long and smooth lay very deep. Alma put a fingertip on it again. "I don't like that," she said. "It looks alive." She said it like a woman looking at a snake under a porch. Lalo laughed to show he wasn't thinking about snakes at all. The call came in from Dr. Klein while we set the next plate. He was the San Antonio geophysicist, prissy sometimes, shoes too, clean with a way of making our hard work sound like his little experiment. He had been asleep when we called, but he was on his second cup by the time he looked at the files we pushed up the line. "That low is interesting," he said, voice tinny through the satellite link. "You're seeing persistent energy around 1 cycle per second. That is much too slow to correlate meaningfully with your sweep. It can alias into your long lags if you aren't careful. Proceed exactly as planned." Do not filter in the field. Tell me if it changes. It's a heartbeat, Alma said softly, because it embarrassed her to sound spooky around Klein. He didn't acknowledge it. We proceeded. Every time we set the plate, the independent low-frequency bump rode through our bones, and every time we lifted, it kept going. The cattle avoided our line and drifted to the fence as far as they could, heads together like churchgoers at a wake. By 7, the wind had shifted and brought the smell of onions from a field outside Asherton, and the faint metallic stink I associate with hospitals. I wished I hadn't thought of hospitals. They are all chests and monitors to me. All that beeping. That can stop if you aren't careful, and even when you are. People in my line will tell you they got into seismic because they like the puzzle of subsurface, but that's a lie for interviews. You get into it because there are long stretches of time where no one tells you a story about a sick child and asks you to fix it. I sat in too many rooms like that as a younger man, hearing my own heartbeat in my ears while another one stumbled, on a monitor. When my daughter died in a place with walls the color of milk and machines that sang in thin mechanical voices, I quit being a paramedic and learned to listen to the ground instead. The ground usually tells the simpler truth. This morning it talked in a way that made the truth strange again. At 8, Klein asked for a cross-line sweep. We turned onto a 2-track that paralleled a dry arroyo, whose banks were scoured white and studded with coyote scat shiny with mesquite beans. A hawk lifted off a fence post with something limp and gray in its feet. We worked the second line, trucks shouldering brush and throwing dust that turned the sun neon at the edges. The thump grew steady enough to count, 68 per minute. By my watch, sometimes 69, sometimes settling back to 66 like it was thinking things over. At shot point 207, the radio spoke again without anyone touching it. "Stop," it said. And this time there was a wobble on the word that pushed between the letters the way a tremor works into a hand when a man is exhausted. "We can stop," Lalo said, trying a joke. "We can head to the diner in Carrizo. Alma can buy." Alma's face was pale under her cap. "We're not stopping," she said. "We don't take words from radios as instructions." I keyed the handheld. "Identify yourself," I said. "Because I have that paramedic calm even when it isn't required." The hiss came as a long, sad inhale. "Stop," it said again, more like a plea than a command, and then the hiss went to the floor like someone put a hand over a mouth. The plan from Klein was to shoot a big patch on Trevino's ranch and the neighboring spreads, a chessboard of values we'd invert later like magic to show him where his ladder was. The more squares we filled, the happier Klein would be. We filled them with the thump playing counter. I tried not to feel it in my chest, but it laid its slow certainty there no matter what I wanted. Every working person breathes by habit. I started counting breaths to make sure I wasn't sinking to an external drummer. 4 in, 6 out. The thump stayed. I worried it would draw me to it like a rattler pulls a hummingbird with a sound only birds know. By mid-morning, the sun pressed down. Heat lifted out of the dirt in sheets. Trevino quit coming to the gates. The cowbirds went scarce. The hawk had moved on. We passed a gate that had no number on the post and a windmill with green blades beyond it, and we kept on because the survey had maps and the maps didn't say anything about green, but I saw Alma's jaw go tight. There were patches of caliche where the tire tracks didn't bite, where the surface had turned to something softer than powder, with a coherence like breathing bread dough. The trucks crossed and left only hints of tread, like we had driven over the top of a drumhead and not quite broken the skin. When we came to shot point 230, Lalo set his plate down and the ground moved first. It gave half an inch around the pad, not collapse exactly, more surge, a rising thing. The hose on the back of the truck trembled as if in a chill. A fence, post 30 yards off, creaked and gave up a tiny dust plume around its base as if worms were shaking it. Alma's geophone string bobbed like a garland. The thump went up to 80. I had that feeling you get when you go into a house that has had a bad thing happen in it recently. The air chooses your skin. Your eyes want to slide off certain corners. I kept my hands on the controls to feel anchored. I lifted the plate and the ground kept rising and falling so gently, my eyes would have missed it if not for the fence post dust. Lalo climbed down and walked stiff-legged away from the truck with his ankles locked as if walking on a deck. He bent to tie his boot and he stopped mid-bend, then he straightened without finishing the knot. He looked back at me with embarrassment and rubbed his chest. "You okay?" I said. "Felt funny," he said. "Like when you lean on a speaker. That's got bass. Sit," I said. He didn't. He put his hand against the base plate while it was lifted, as if to feel the absence of a thing, and matched his breathing to the ground without meaning to. It is rare to watch a man's breath try to go out of step and then fail, so the breath rides someone else's rhythm. His face did what people's faces do just before a syncope. I took him by the arm, the way I used to take people who were about to faint, and I sat and pulled him down with me and put his head low. "Stop." The radio whispered so softly it lived under the hiss rather than above it. The word curled into my spine. I said the word back, not into the radio, just to the dirt. "We hear you. We'll stop for a minute." We stopped. We turned the trucks off. The wind picked up little shreds of our tire dust and carried them toward a white sky that had scabbed over with high cloud. The ground thumped under our seated bodies twice, 3 times, 4 times, like we were in some huge chest listening from inside the ribcage. The cattle had gone so distant they might have been shadows someone painted and left to dry. Somewhere near the arroyo, a muffled sound like a hand on a hollow table repeated in time but softer. I had never in my life thought an empty ditch could sound like a heartbeat. Then I realized it wasn't empty under the ditch. Nothing under us was empty enough to be quiet anymore. I keyed Klein and told him what we had. He believed the numbers and disregarded the nouns. He said it was either anthropogenic noise from some piece of equipment or a natural resonance from a shallow cavity, possibly a buried culvert or a sinkhole forming. He told us to mark the coordinates and proceed to the squares he wanted. He would do the clever part later. "You sure you want us to keep vibrating where the ground is moving on its own?" Alma said. She never phrased a question as a challenge. She made it a fair request. "Yes," Klein said. "Resonance is interesting. It might move your noise into a stable pattern we can subtract. If you stop every time a cow farts, we will never finish." We did what oilfield hands do. We did the job we were paid for, the way a doctor's assistant holds the light where she's told even if the hole the doctor is working in smells like the center of something wrong. We set the plate. The ground pushed back. I watched the trace. The low frequency wrote itself bright and proud as a separate animal under the sweep. I didn't filter it. I saved it all. By 11, the thump had a character that can only be described as alive. We crossed a power line and the insulator sang. We skirted a stock tank where the water bore concentric rings at that same pace, a record player with a warped vinyl. The tank had little greenish frogs, their eyes like copper coins, and their throats ballooned and subsided not to their own calls, but to the ground's. When the radio spoke again, the word was there, and so was something else. Oh, sound that isn't speech but carries the sense of a person, a swallowing maybe, a man trying not to cry. "Stop," the radio said. The swallowing sound followed like a tail. "Please." We were heading toward a corner where the survey line met a little family cemetery on the ranch, the kind with iron. Pipe rails rusted to a color like old sorghum and names hammered shallow into granite. The flags cut around it. A now dead Trevino lay there, and a woman with the same name as the rancher's first name for her last. There were little stones for babies who had never seen a July and had never learned how carrizo grass sings in the wind by the highway. I stood with my hat in my hands without meaning to and counted steps so I wouldn't be there the same number of heartbeats as the ground. It was Alma who heard the other thing. We were rolling to the next point when she told Lalo to kill the truck, and she got down and stood very still with her head turned like a deer. She held her breath. She put her fingertips in the caliche dust and then she broke. She turned her hand palm up and I watched the dust there rise in perfect little puffs that had nothing to do with breeze. She looked at me. "It's saying my name," she said. "Do you hear that in the spaces, in the hiss?" I listened and heard only the word that wasn't a word. The ground saying thump and the radio saying stop. But I believed her without eye-rolling because I know what it is to hear your own name from an empty place. She stepped back from the dust as if it had burned. We could have quit then. No one would have fired us. Trevino would have signed off on our day. Klein would have called someone else stubborn. We did not quit because money has a gravity, and because finishing a line feels like winning a small and sour game that proves you are fitter than whatever you cross. We set the plate again at the fence line, just outside the cemetery's pipe. A gust came and rattled the fake flowers on a headstone. Lalo coughed and rubbed his sternum again. Alma wiped her palm on her jeans and her eyes went bright at the edges, but she didn't cry. The trucks hummed their clean, controllable note. The ground thumped once against my kneecaps, once against the truck's frame, and then a half beat later came a third. A little echo beat that shouldn't have been, like a heart about to go bad. I shot a look at Lalo. "Sit down," I said. And I didn't say it twice because the good voice in a person only has room for one command in a moment like that. He didn't sit. He took 2 careful steps, and then he made a sound people make when fear finds a handhold inside the ribs. "It's not my heart," he said. "It's not in me. It's around me." The radio unkeyed and breathed static with a roughness like wool on a cheek. The word came again, but too quiet to be a word, just the shape of it. A plea made by someone who knows talking has never helped. The thump went to 94. The stock tank threw rings like a coin had been dropped. The fence post dust plumed and settled and plumed again. From the arroyo, the muffled drum appeared, and I understood that all the voids under the ranch were breathing now. The old culverts, the little caves under uprooted taproots, the old wellheads that had been cut and capped and buried vertical like bones. Klein called again. He was excited. He wanted longer sweeps, and then shorter sweeps, and then a little break. He did not want us to leave. He wanted the anomaly on our tapes because the anomaly made his career if it turned into a paper or a lease. He talked as if we were standing on the back of something famous and we only had to press the right buttons to bring it into the light. "You're to the south end," he said. "I see a low-velocity anomaly at depth with a strange attenuation. Halo. It's moving. The window is moving. Can you see that? It looks like a phase reversal traveling downline. I have never seen that." "I can see it," I said. "What do you think it is?" "Resonant cavity," he said too fast. "A hydrologic body, or a karst collapse beginning. Possibly a trapped pocket, possibly the Saltillo. I don't know. Keep the trucks on surprise and watch your plate pressures." He told us to keep pushing surprise like surprise was a thing men might seed into dirt like oats. I wanted to ask him if his heart was steady while he watched our graphs from a safe building, but I didn't. Lalo looked bad. Alma, who jokes all day about everything, had gone so quiet I wanted to put a hand on her shoulder just to see if she flinched. We swept. The thump climbed to 100 and came down to 80 and settled at a number that matched my breath without asking me. The radio spoke once more and it did not say stop. It said my name. It said it as if my mother had said it in the kitchen in a house we had sold years ago. It put the syllables in the air like a long disused key finding a lock. No one else on. The crew heard it. It was mine, and while it said me, I smelled hospital disinfectant and I saw a little hand with a purple bruise around an IV tape, and I thought for a second that the past doesn't just echo, it waits. I'm not a religious man. I have been to enough deaths to know that the only thing a body always gives up is heat, and that a person is mostly the stories you tell about them after. But standing inside a circle of iron pipe around names of babies and feeling the ground under me mark time on my bones, I believe the earth can carry a thing the way tape carries music. It can keep it and repeat it and distort it and play it back whenever something pressurized leans on it in the right way. It had taken our sweeps and made a drum from them and then found other beats to lay over. If you vibrate a memory long enough, it becomes a presence. You might say that is all a haunting is. By noon, the clouds gathered a brown light that means rain that won't fall or will fall as mud. Klein told us to take a lunch in the shade of the cemetery oaks because he wanted to pull down a heavier filter and push a new set of instructions. Lalo didn't eat. He sipped water and pretended it was to keep his mouth from drying. Alma ate a burrito like a woman who knows her hand will shake if she stops. We sat on the truck steps and listened to a county that had turned into a slow drum. A diesel out on the highway came and went. and for a full minute after it passed, there was a low boom where it had been, as if sound had thickened and would not go to zero. Then the first cattle lowed again, the sound torn, as if something under their hooves had pressed back with a purpose beyond physics. A buck rabbit ran right up to the truck and looked at its own reflection in the chrome, and then ran past without caring. We were men in its way. The windmill with green blades spun lazy and gave a single loud snap from its head as a wire took up slack, and that snap did not end right away. It rang in the pipe as if the pipe went down past where pipes should dare. Klein came back on. "One more thing," he said, voice hot with discovery. "At your last 3 points, the low is writing a waveform that looks like an EKG when you blow it up. It can't be, but it looks like that. It's an artifact, but it is very good. Do you hear me?" "I hear you," I said, but I didn't say what the sound did to me. He asked for a special sweep. He wanted us to set at a clutch of mesquite where the brush made a low circle like a nest. He wanted us to run a symmetrical sweep that would cancel its own impulse at zero lag. A sweet math trick that leaves the world as if we were never there. And then he wanted us to run a destructive test, a heavy push at a single frequency near the grounds. I knew before he said it that he wanted to line the thumper's heart to the counties and see who learned whose rhythm. I thought that was a bad idea, the way you think jumping into a river shaped like a snake is a bad idea. "We can do the cancellation," I said. "We aren't doing the destructive, not with people on the ground." "I am telling you," Klein said. His voice had gone flat. "Run the single frequency." "I am telling you no," I said. And I waited for Alma to tell me I would lose my job, and she didn't. Lalo made a grateful sound and rubbed his chest again. I told Klein we would run the clean set, and then we would see. I put the radio down and breathed 4 in and 6 out, counting with my fingers so I could force my lungs to be mine. We set the plate at the mesquite ring and we ran the symmetrical. It was a relief to feel a thing that was built to cancel itself. The ground seemed to sigh like a man whose back has been pressed too long into a bad chair. The thump kept going, at its number. We lifted. Alma looked at me. "I think I know where it's coming from," she said. "Where?" I said. She pointed at the earth. Not down, not generically. She pointed toward the Arroyo's bend, to a place where the brush was a little darker, and the soil had a crust that looked a shade different from the rest. "We had a line here last year," she said. "Different crew. They pulled off early, said the numbers sucked. There's a capped wellhead down there from the 40s. My uncle worked on that lease when he was young. He said some guys fell into a vent and never came out. They filled it and poured a slab. He said you can hear dogs howl by it without moving their mouths. You think sound is getting trapped under the slab," I said. I wanted to call it a slab because a slab is a human object and not whatever the opposite of a human object is. "I think something is talking through it," she said. And she didn't blush when she used that word because the day had gotten past blushing. We drove there slow, the truck set to under 5 to keep from tearing the crust. The spot was where the arroyo hooked north. The ground dipped as if it wanted to become a pond if rains would bless it. There were 4 mesquite in a square, and in the middle a square of caliche that had been tamped with a plate compactor in somebody else's lifetime. A circle of darker soil ringed it. When I stepped onto the slab, the ground said thump and the slab said the same thump but with a little delay. Lalo did not step onto it. He stood with his hand on the truck, posture that of a man taking strength from a fender. We all heard the radio. We all heard the word that got born in the hiss. It came out with no emotion left in it, because it had used up every single bit over, the last hours of no one listening. "Stop." "Okay," I said. And I didn't say it to Klein or to Lalo or to Alma. I said it to the square of tamped earth we had decided was a slab. "Okay, what do you want me to stop?" It answered me in the way ground can answer. The thump slowed 3 beats and then held. A fly landed on my wrist and I let it. The breeze gave the mesquite leaves a sound like paper dresses, a long way. Off a truck put its horn on a cow. The slab held its slow drum. I went back to the truck and pulled up the EKG filter Klein had pushed but not been able to use from there. It was a nonsense overlay that would find a certain kind of peak and a certain kind of trough and draw them with little teeth. An insult to both soil and hearts. When I laid it on our thump, the screen did a wicked thing. It drew something like a normal sinus beat, and then it drew a little extra like a heart, trying to throw a premature ventricular contraction. I looked at Lalo with new fear. "Sit," I said again. He sat. He eased himself down like his bones had become more breakable than the rest of him. I said my girl's name in my head. I hadn't used it in a long time. I saw the monitor from that night and the way a nurse had silenced one alarm but left another, and had put a hand on my shoulder and told me the thing people always tell themselves they want, which is that there was nothing more to do. I thought if the ground carried tape of men falling or oil roaring in a casing or cattle breathing or cattle dying or of the highway talking to itself, it might also carry something as small as that room, because a thing that hurts looks large in a mind, but it is small in the world. The radio exhaled, and then the voice came through, not like speech but like air, pressed into shape by a chest that shouldn't talk. It said my name again, and then it said a single word that had no edges. "Please," it said. I told Klein we were done for the day. He cussed like a man whose paper had been taken from his hand in front of his teacher. He told me not to be sentimental. He told me he didn't need friends. He told me to turn my plate back on and press at 90. I told him I would turn my plate back on and press at 0. I meant I was going to put the steel against the slab and hum nothing into it as a way of touching something without touching it. I did it. I lowered the plate and put the full weight on the slab. The ground pushed back once, hard enough to lift my stomach against my throat, and then it met the plate like two men testing a handshake. I took my hand off the control stick. Alma set her palm on the base plate, gentle. Lalo covered his eyes with his forearm. The radio gave a soft old man sound that might have been relief if you had never heard relief before. The thump slowed by, too. It stayed there like a big animal that had decided not to bolt. We sat with our hands on the steel, listeners with our backs to a fence between a family's dead and a pasture. The smell of rain came without rain. The clouds moving over us made the light shift like a hand on a dimmer. For 15 minutes, the world at that bend did one thing, and that thing was breathe. It is a strong thing to sit in company with something that has been alone a long time and choose to do nothing to it. When I finally raised the plate, the ground kept its thump, but at a number that no longer made my sternum want to be a drum. We packed, we coiled cords, we rolled out with a care I wish men offered each other more often. Klein tried me again, once, and then gave up to his data. We returned to the gate where Trevino had stood with his thermos. He wasn't there. The bottle crosses rattled against wire like polite applause. That night I lay in the little motel in Carrizo Springs and listened to the air conditioner thump at the same number as the ranch until it shifted, because machines do. And then I went to the sink and ran the tap and put my fingers in the stream. For a second, the cold water beat the count we had been keeping. I do not know whether I cried. The light over the mirror made a noise like bees. In the morning, we went back. We told ourselves we would clean up the line and take what we had and not press again on the slab. We didn't talk about what we would do if Klein called. And we didn't talk about Alma hearing her name. And we didn't talk about what had said mine. The sky had scoured clean. A vulture drew a figure 8 over the fence line. The county looked as normal as a Sunday shirt. At shot point 250, a mile west of the slab, the thump returned at the same number it had chosen. It did not ask us to stop. It did not slow or speed. When the radio hissed, it held only hiss. The trace on the screen laid the low out in a line smooth enough to be a yardstick. At the end of the day, Klein drove down. He stood where we had stood, and he put his foot on the slab and looked embarrassed because something moved back at him that he could not put on a graph. He asked us to show him the special sweep he had wanted, the destructive one, and I said no again, and he looked at Alma as if she might give him a better answer, and she said no in a tone that would have stopped a bus. He didn't push it. He walked around and around the square of caliche and kicked at the darker ring of soil until Alma told him to stop, because her uncle had said, "You don't mess with circles that decide to be circles." He laughed and he didn't kick again. The last thing we did before we pulled the geophones was set 3 little recorders at the slab's edge with nails and bits of angle iron. We left them so the night could write on them. The morning brought 3 files that were not music and were not silence. The morning brought 40 minutes on the first, 16 on the second, 6 on the third, before the battery died, of a thump that had chosen to be unremarkable at last. The number of a man, In a chair reading, of a woman at a sink, of a baby sleeping without wires on her skin. In the middle of the second file, there was a garble like a man clearing his throat, and then something that could have been a word if it had wanted to be. Listen, it might have said, but it didn't need to. We finished the job 2 days later. Klein took his data and went back to a city where the ground is hidden under concrete and people mistake a heartbeat for a notification on their phones. Trevino signed and took his check and said nothing interesting had happened on his place, and would we patch the ruts at the gate because his wife didn't like puddles. Lalo went to a doctor in Eagle Pass because he was scared of what he had felt, and the doctor told him he was fine and to eat less salt. Alma told me she no longer wanted to work nights, and I told her okay. We returned the trucks to the yard, and the yard man stamped our forms, and when he handed mine back, his knuckles tapped the counter twice in a rhythm that made me look up. He hadn't meant it. The world had learned an easy song. On my off day, I drove back to the bend without telling Alma and parked at the fence. I took a coffee I didn't want and a piece of chalk. I walked to the slab and stood on it and said, nothing for a time I didn't count. The birds had more to do. The wind had turned north. The slab was warmer than the dirt. I drew a small heart on the edge with the chalk and watched the dust make the line thick. It looked like what kids draw when they mean a heart and not what men see on screens. And I was ashamed of the symbol while loving it because the world makes us both ways. I rubbed it out with my boot. The ground thumped and I matched my breathing to something else again, but this time I did not feel stolen by it. I felt like a person humming with a choir. My own drum kept its agency. I set my hand on the caliche and thought of a girl I had carried and a nurse who had held a hand in my back and a machine that had learned to speak without a mouth and had whispered please into a hospital like a prayer that got to the wrong address. I said out loud a word I had not said in a very long time because I had been embarrassed by what it requires when you say it, and the world does not answer. Thank you, I said. To the slab, to the dirt, to the machines, to the county, to the thing that had learned our names in static and had asked us to stop and then had stopped asking. The word hung there not like an offering, but like a breath I intended to keep taking. If there is evidence of the day, it lives on a compact flashcard that is in my toolbox under a wrench. It shows a low-frequency pattern shaped in places like the teeth of a smile and in places like a Sunday shirt laid flat. It shows nothing that a man like Klein can put in a paper without being laughed out of a room, and also everything he wanted but didn't know how to want. When I play it back on headphones, I don't hear my name anymore, and I don't hear stop, and I don't hear please. I hear a county that had learned the shape of us and had refused to be pushed into a bad number. Sometimes at night my house ticks the way houses do when they think, and I wake and listen to the space under my bed. Sometimes I hear the refrigerator compressor take a breath and I smile. I have stopped counting my inhale and my exhale. If I die, I hope it is sitting on a piece of earth and not on a floor that smells of milk. If the county keeps its drum when the oil is finished and the cattle thin, maybe what it will be beating is not the sound of men falling or wells roaring or tires thudding past, but the little easy number we left on the slab like a note pinned with a magnet on a fridge. Here is how to breathe when you've forgotten. A week later, Alma texted me a picture from the yard. Lalo had drawn a heart on the side of the vibe plate with a paint pen. Not the Valentine's kind, the real kind, the fist-sized knot of muscle with fat little arteries. He had shaded it like a child and labeled it with an arrow. Plate. It was wrong and it was right. She wrote, idiot, and a smile. I wrote back, keep it, and a word that means love in the way hands mean love when they put steel down gentle. She didn't answer, and she didn't need to. At night, the yard man must hear little taps on his counter and think mice, and maybe he is right. Or maybe the county we worked that month taught our bones and our knuckles and our machines a song that we will thump without thinking until all of us go quiet. And maybe when we do, there will be a slab somewhere that will hold the number we kept and offer it to whatever walks by with a hand open and a chest that needs a metronome. The last time I drove past Trevino's, the bottle crosses had taken on a slow click and a wind that barely moved the brush. The cattle were on the far side. The windmill with green blades was still, I parked just long enough to watch the dust settle in rings where tires had been, and to put my palm on the fence post. The post gave back a tiny push, not a request, not a plea, not a command, just the announcement of presence. I pressed my palm a little harder until I could feel the bone of the post and the bone of my hand argue softly about who belonged to whom. It felt like a conversation that could go on for a long time without either of us winning and without either of us needing to. Then I drove on toward Carrizo and the blue sign for coffee and the bad eggs, and I did not look into the ditch when it passed because the sound it made just then was mine already and I didn't have to watch it to know. I kept my hand on the wheel and my breath uncounted and let the county do what it had decided to do, which was to echo the living until we learned how to stop pressing and start listening, and I can think of worse arrangements between dirt and men. An unmarked fuel trailer sat on a caliche pad outside Mentone, Texas, glowing like a beacon in the dark desert. The lamp above it buzzed and spat bugs against its halo of yellow light, the cone spilling down over the dusty tank and the hose coiled at its side. Nothing else moved for miles. No traffic, no houses. Just flat black horizon broken by low brush and mesquite twisted from the dry wind. The kind of nothing that made you feel like you'd slipped off the edge of the world. I shouldn't have stopped. Every company rule said you don't fuel at a site that isn't marked. You don't know what you're getting if it's even diesel, or if the tank hasn't sat for years gathering water and grit. But I didn't have the luxury of choice. I'd run west out of Odessa with the gauge too low, telling myself I could stretch it. By the time the warning light blinked, I was past every exit worth turning back for, and the road behind me might as well have been another country. Out here, when the tank runs dry, you're done. That glow pulled me in. I eased my rig up to the pad, engine rattling like a dying animal. The tires crunched over the chalky caliche. I climbed down, boots hitting powder, and the air tasted like dust and old copper. The keypad on the pump glowed faint green. A card reader waited, plastic cracked and sun-faded. I slid my card in, hands shaking, sweat running down the back of my neck. Declined. Tried again. Declined. Third time, same. My chest tightened. I could already see the gauge inside, so far below E the needle looked broken. Then the printer clicked. Paper curled out of the slot, edges serrated, fluttering in the wind. I frowned, pulled it free. Receipt printed. Paid. In full. Customer. Daniel Reeves. My name. And at the top, in sharp black block letters, the date, June 13th, 1993. I was 4 years old in June of '93. I stood there, the printer quiet now, the receipt cold in my hand. The pad was empty, silent, only the lamp buzzing. My card hadn't cleared. I hadn't punched in my name, but the machine had printed it anyway. I should have walked, should have climbed back in and taken my chances. But the hiss of diesel when I squeezed the nozzle was too comforting, too familiar. The tank drank it down like water in the desert, and I stood there with my mind chewing itself raw, telling myself it was a glitch, a leftover unit no one had pulled. When the tanks were full, I hung the nozzle back. The hose hissed, almost like a sigh. The lamp above buzzed louder, and for a second I thought I heard something under it, a murmur like a voice just out of earshot. I froze, head cocked, nothing but wind. I climbed back in the cab, receipt stuffed in my pocket, and rolled off. The pad. In the mirror, the light shrank until it was a pinprick, then vanished. I told myself I'd forget it by morning. I didn't. In El Paso, the way station flagged me. The trooper flipped my logbook, then stopped too long on one page. "You know this date's wrong?" he asked. I frowned. He turned the book. At the top of yesterday's page, I'd written June 13, 1993. Today's June 14, 1993. Both signed, my name scrawled messy at the bottom. The rest of the book, September 2025, was neat, correct. Only those 2 pages wrong. The trooper let me go with a warning, but he gave me a look like he wanted to keep me, like maybe he should have. That night, when I emptied my pocket for change, the receipt was still there. Only now the ink had blurred, and below my printed name was something handwritten, faint, like it had bled through from the other side. 2 words, UO. I crumpled it, tossed it out the window, told myself I was done thinking about it. But the world didn't let me forget. 3 nights later, in a diner off I-10 near Sierra Blanca, the waitress poured my coffee, and as casual as anything, she said, "Haven't seen you since '93. The pot froze in her hand. Her face went slack like she hadn't meant to say it. She set the pot down hard and walked away without looking back. That's when I knew something had followed me. I started seeing the date everywhere, on receipts, on bills of lading, on road signs where numbers blurred at the edge of my headlights, June 13th, 1993. My logbook pages kept slipping back to it no matter how many times I tore them out, and the dreams started. In them, I was standing on that pad, caliche under my boots, lamp buzzing overhead. The trailer loomed white, hose swaying, but the light reached farther in the dream, spreading across desert flat until I saw shadows standing in it. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Men in work clothes, hats low, faces blacked out by distance. All of them turned toward me. None of them moved, except their mouths. They all mouthed the same word, lips moving in silence. Oh. Every time I woke gasping, the smell of diesel in my nose. I tried to burn the receipt. I lit a match in a motel trash can and watched the flame curl it black, edges crumbling. I felt relief like a fever breaking. But when I zipped my duffel the next morning, the paper was folded inside, unburned, the ink darker than before. By the end of that week, my card stopped working altogether. Every station I pulled into declined, yet every time the printer spit a receipt, dated June 13th, 1993, paid in full, Daniel Reeves. And every time, a little more handwriting bled in under my name. Scratches of ink, barely legible, like a record, keeping itself. Miles driven, hours logged, places stopped, all from 32 years ago. But I hadn't lived them. I drove through Mentone again once, weeks later. Couldn't help myself. The town looked smaller than ever. Half the trailers, gone, the gas station boarded. When I cut down the county road, the pad was still there. So was the trailer. The lamp burned steady, bugs cracking against its glow. And in the mirror, when I pulled away, I swear I saw someone else standing at the pump. A man in coveralls, head bent, hand on the nozzle. Looked just like me, only thinner, younger. His truck was older too, a square body with faded paint, but the plates read the same as mine. I didn't stop. I've kept the truck moving ever since. Long hauls, short runs, doesn't matter. The more I move, the quieter it stays. But every now and then, when I check the glove box or reach under the seat, I find another receipt. Same date, same name, same words scrawled darker and darker. UO. And I know someday the tanks will run dry again, and the only place left with diesel will be that pad outside Mentone, with its lamp buzzing, its hose hissing, and its printer waiting to tell me just how long the debt's been running. Because debts always come due, and I think mine started June 13th, 1993.